Susan B. Anthony, born in 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts, was a woman whose life was defined by a quiet yet relentless pursuit of justice. Growing up in a family committed to equality and education, she soon developed a passion for social reform, one that would span decades and change the course of history. Her dedication to securing the right to vote for women made her one of the most pivotal figures in the women's suffrage movement. Through the many challenges of her time, Susan remained a steady and unwavering voice, advocating for what she knew was right. Her journey was not one of rapid fame, but of slow, deliberate progress, a life of quiet determination that led her to become one of the most recognized and respected names in American history. As you listen to her story unfold, let the peaceful rhythm of her life carry you through the years. If you find comfort in this tale of steadfast conviction, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing where you're listening from. But for now, simply let the gentle unfolding of Susan B. Anthony's life drift softly through your mind, guiding you into a restful and quiet slumber. Susan B. Anthony was born on February 15, 1820, in the small town of Adams, Massachusetts, into a Quaker family. Her parents, Daniel and Pauline, were committed to progressive values and deeply rooted in the Quaker faith, which emphasized equality, social justice, and a sense of community. Susan's upbringing was marked by an atmosphere of intellectual curiosity, where education and personal development were highly valued. As a child, Susan was quiet and introspective, with a natural curiosity that led her to ask many questions. Her father, a stern but loving figure, was a key influence in her early life, teaching her about the importance of standing up for one's principles and pursuing fairness for all people. Her mother, Pauline, was equally influential, instilling in Susan a deep sense of duty to help those who were disadvantaged, whether due to gender, race, or social status. Susan's early years were not marked by any sense of privilege, despite the family's relatively comfortable financial situation. The Anthony family had a strict religious lifestyle, and Susan was expected to uphold the family's values through her actions and choices. The Quaker belief in the equality of all people, including women, would become the cornerstone of Susan's thinking and activism. In fact, it was this early environment that would shape the trajectory of Susan's later work as an advocate for women's rights. At the time of Susan's birth, the United States was still a young nation, and much of the country's social structure was rigid, with strict roles for men and women. Susan's understanding of fairness and justice developed within this framework, but her early life experiences also showed her that there was much work to be done in changing the prevailing views of gender roles. Despite the cultural norms of the time, Susan was raised with the understanding that education should be a universal right, not limited by gender. By the age of 6, Susan had already developed a keen sense of social justice. Her natural inclination toward fairness began to manifest in her early interactions with her peers. At the time, girls were generally not encouraged to pursue education beyond the basic level, especially in rural settings like Adams. However, Susan's parents believed in the power of knowledge, and they made sure their children, including Susan, were well educated. She attended school in Adams, where she thrived in her studies, particularly in mathematics and reading. Susan's formal education was, however, short-lived. In 1826, when she was just 6 years old, her family faced financial difficulties, and the decision was made to send Susan's father and older siblings to work in the family's mill. With the economic strain that came with the mill's closure, the Anthony family moved to Battenville, New York, where Susan's father sought new work. Though it was a time of hardship, Susan continued her education, privately studying under the guidance of her father and other family members who believed in the importance of intellectual growth. It was in these early years, while living in New York, that Susan developed a deep sense of responsibility to others. She saw the struggles of her family firsthand, and this only reinforced her desire to make a difference in the world. Susan often reflected on the values instilled in her by her parents and the Quaker faith, which emphasized compassion and respect for others, regardless of their social status or gender. By the time she was 8 years old, Susan's thoughts had already turned toward issues of social justice. She was particularly drawn to the cause of abolition, which was beginning to gain momentum in the United States. Although her parents did not explicitly encourage her activism at this stage, their own commitment to equality and justice served as a quiet guide. In the quiet moments of her childhood, as Susan watched her family navigate hardship, she began to realize that much of the inequality in the world stemmed from entrenched societal norms and attitudes toward gender and race. As Susan grew, she began to understand that, like slavery, gender inequality was an issue of great significance, one that needed to be addressed with the same urgency. Her early life, therefore, laid the foundation for the determination and resilience that would later define her life's work. She grew up in an environment that, while nurturing, also instilled in her a sense of duty to challenge societal injustices, lessons she would carry with her throughout her life. By 1828, Susan had reached a point in her young life where her belief in equality and education had fully taken root. Though still a child, she'd already begun to question the restrictions placed upon her because of her gender. Even in the rural setting of Battenville, where she faced the same traditional gender expectations as other young girls, Susan knew that there was more she could do, and more that society should allow her to do. The quiet, determined spirit that Susan B. Anthony exhibited as a child would become the driving force behind her later activism. From these early years, we can see the seeds of a lifelong commitment to justice, whether it was the fight for the abolition of slavery or the eventual fight for women's suffrage. Her early years in Adams and Battenville were not just about learning mathematics and reading, but also about shaping a mindset that would be her guide throughout the difficult and sometimes dangerous battles that lay ahead. As we transition from Susan's childhood to her formative years, we move from a young girl who was quietly developing her beliefs into a woman who would challenge the social structures of her time. Her journey was not one of immediate fame or recognition, but a steady and gradual unfolding of her commitment to justice, rooted in the values of her family and community. And so, as we begin to explore her transition from childhood to adolescence, we see the quiet blossoming of the woman who would go on to change the course of history. In the late 1820s, as Susan B. Anthony was growing older, her family's move to Battenville, New York, marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. The Anthony family was deeply committed to the Quaker faith, a faith rooted in the principles of equality, simplicity, peace, and social justice. For Susan, these values would become the foundation upon which her life's work was built. Quakers believed in the inherent equality of all people, men and women alike. This belief was not simply theoretical, it was ingrained in the way they lived their daily lives. In the Quaker community, women were encouraged to speak and participate in church meetings, something quite radical for the time. Susan's parents, Daniel and Pauline, were strict in their adherence to these values, ensuring that their children were not only educated but also instilled with a sense of moral duty to stand up for justice and equality. Susan's father, Daniel Anthony, was a staunch abolitionist who believed that slavery was a great moral evil. He was also a strong advocate for the rights of women, although the full extent of his views on gender equality would not be fully realized until later in his daughter's life. Daniel's dedication to social justice was something that profoundly shaped Susan's worldview. He was a man of quiet conviction, not given to loud speeches or protests, but his influence on Susan was subtle and deep. His actions spoke louder than words, and Susan watched closely as he worked tirelessly for causes he believed in. Her mother, Pauline, was equally influential. Though not as publicly vocal as her husband, Pauline was a woman of deep faith and compassion. She was a steady presence in Susan's life, guiding her with quiet wisdom and a deep commitment to kindness and fairness. In their home, the values of the Quaker faith were not only taught but lived. Pauline's nurturing spirit and Daniel's moral fortitude created an environment where Susan was not only encouraged to think independently, but also to act on her beliefs. During these years in Battenville, Susan began to experience firsthand the limitations placed on women in society. In the Quaker tradition, women had more rights than they did in the outside world. But even within this relatively progressive faith, there are still roles and expectations for women that Susan would soon begin to question. She saw how women were expected to focus on domestic duties and not given the same opportunities as men, especially in education and public life. Susan's Quaker upbringing also encouraged her to see herself as part of a larger community, bound by the principle of equality. The idea of standing up for others, particularly those who were marginalized, was central to the Quaker faith. This idea would become a driving force in Susan's later activism. It was here, in the Quaker community, that Susan began to understand the importance of social reform and the idea that true justice meant advocating for the rights of all people, regardless of gender, race, or class. As Susan matured, her sense of justice began to grow sharper. She was not content to simply observe the inequalities around her. She began to feel a deep, burning desire to change them. Her growing awareness of the world around her fueled her passion for social justice, and she started to question why women, in particular, were so often relegated to the background. Why were they denied the same opportunities as men? Why were their voices so often silenced in matters of great importance? Despite these early inklings of her future activism, Susan was still a young girl, only in her teens. The confines of her gender were not something she could easily change, but her growing awareness of the injustices she saw around her would shape the way she moved through the world. As the years passed, Susan's questions would become more focused, and her resolve to fight for equality would only strengthen. Though she was still a child, Susan's experiences in Battenville were pivotal in shaping her understanding of the world. Her Quaker values of equality and justice had given her a strong foundation, and she was beginning to see that those values were not just abstract concepts, they were calls to action. At this stage in her life, Susan was not yet an activist, but she was certainly beginning to think in ways that would lead her down that path. In these early years, Susan also learned the value of hard work and determination. The Anthony family was not wealthy, and they faced many struggles, especially in the years following the move to Battenville. Susan learned the importance of perseverance and the value of staying true to one's beliefs, even in the face of hardship. These lessons would serve her well in the years to come, as she faced challenges that would test her resolve. As we move forward, we see Susan beginning to transition from a young girl questioning the world around her to a young woman determined to make a difference. Her experiences in Battenville, shaped by the values of her Quaker upbringing, helped to cultivate the sense of justice that would become the driving force of her life. The quiet yet firm belief in equality, instilled by her parents and the Quaker community, would guide her through the many challenges she would face in the years ahead. As Susan B. Anthony entered her teenage years, she found herself at a crossroads of both intellectual awakening and personal struggle. In the early 1830s, the Anthony family continued to face financial hardships, and they moved once again, this time to a more stable home in the small town of Battenville, New York. Although the financial situation improved, it became clear that Susan's future would be shaped not only by her upbringing, but also by the limitations imposed on her as a young girl. During these years, Susan attended several schools, but her experience with formal education was not without its difficulties. She was an eager and diligent student, with an insatiable curiosity that drove her to excel in mathematics and reading. However, despite her capabilities, Susan quickly became frustrated by the restrictions placed on her because of her gender. In the early 19th century, girls were often seen as inferior to boys in terms of intellectual ability, and educational opportunities for women were extremely limited. At the time, girls were often not encouraged to pursue higher learning or enter professions outside of the home. The curriculum that was offered to young women was largely confined to domestic skills, such as sewing, cooking, and managing a household, far from the rigorous academic education afforded to boys. Susan, however, was determined to learn. She refused to be bound by the conventional expectations of women, and her intellectual pursuits became a form of silent resistance. Her family was supportive of her education, but Susan's frustration with the limitations imposed on her by society became increasingly evident. While boys were encouraged to take part in subjects like science, history, and mathematics, girls were often relegated to more appropriate pursuits. Susan's yearning for knowledge, especially in subjects that were considered unsuitable for women, became a source of both personal conflict and motivation. During this period, Susan often turned to her father for encouragement. Daniel Anthony was a firm believer in the value of education for both boys and girls. He had himself been a teacher and believed that every child, regardless of gender, deserved the right to pursue an education that would allow them to reach their full potential. Though his views were progressive for the time, Daniel could only do so much within the confines of the societal structures of the day. Nonetheless, Susan's father's support gave her the strength to continue her education, even when the world around her suggested that women like her should be content with a limited role. As Susan struggled to navigate these limitations, she began to notice the larger societal injustices that extended beyond education. The more she learned about the world around her, the more she saw the systemic inequities faced by women. Even within the Quaker faith, which emphasized equality, women were still subject to many of the same societal restrictions that other women faced. The idea that women could not participate fully in public life, or have the same educational opportunities as men, was something that Susan could not accept. Susan's frustration with these inequities fueled her desire to take action. As she moved further into adolescence, she started to explore different ways to advocate for the rights of women and girls. She came to understand that her fight was not just for herself, but for all women who were denied the basic human right to an equal education and opportunity. She began to view her own struggles as part of a much larger global fight for social justice and equality. During this time, Susan also became increasingly aware of the plight of African Americans, particularly as the abolitionist movement began to grow. Her father's strong stance against slavery had an enduring influence on her, and she soon found herself involved in the fight for abolition. However, as she became more deeply immersed in both the women's suffrage and abolition movements, she realized that the cause of women's rights and the cause of African Americans' rights were interconnected. Both were struggles against deeply ingrained societal systems that sought to keep certain groups of people marginalized and disenfranchised. Although Susan's early education was shaped by frustration and barriers, it was also marked by resilience. She learned to navigate the rigid social structures of her time with determination and quiet rebellion. It was during these formative years that Susan B. Anthony's belief in the inherent equality of all people began to crystallize, and she developed the steadfast resolve that would define her life's work. Her early education also introduced Susan to the concept of activism. While she had few opportunities to express her views in public at this point in her life, she began to understand the power of speaking out and taking action. The education she received, combined with her growing awareness of societal injustices, sowed the seeds of the activism that would later define her. By the age of 15, Susan had already begun to see the limitations placed on women in ways that would later fuel her work as a suffragist. In this segment of her life, she was still far from the public figure she would become, but her thoughts and beliefs were beginning to take shape. Her quiet, determined rebellion against the norms of her society especially in relation to education and gender, set the stage for the activist she would become. It is during this period that we see the first glimpses of the bold, courageous leader who would dedicate her life to advocating for women's rights. Her early education, struggles, and awareness of injustice would lead Susan B. Anthony to a lifelong commitment to the cause of equality for all people, regardless of gender, race, or social class. In the coming years, Susan would find her voice as an activist, and it was these early struggles that would serve as the foundation for her later work. By the time Susan B. Anthony reached the age of 25, she had faced several personal and societal challenges that would eventually shape her into the dedicated activist she would become. In the mid-1840s, Susan's early years of education were beginning to pay off, and she sought a career that would allow her to make a meaningful impact on her community. Though she was passionate about social reform, her chosen path at the time was that of a teacher. In 1845, Susan accepted a teaching position at a female academy in the town of Canajoharie, New York. It was here that she first began to develop a sense of independence. The position was a significant step in her life, both personally and professionally. It marked her transition from a young woman finding her place in the world to a confident adult taking on responsibilities. As a teacher, she had the opportunity to shape the minds of young girls and boys, imparting knowledge and values that she felt were essential to their growth. Her work in Canajoharie exposed her to the realities of teaching in a society where girls were expected to receive a less rigorous education than boys. The curriculum was limited, and the expectations for female students were far less ambitious than those for their male counterparts. Despite this, Susan poured her energy into creating a productive and enriching learning environment for her students. She was deeply committed to providing them with the best education possible, recognizing that education was the key to empowerment. However, Susan was not content with simply fulfilling her role as a teacher. As much as she loved her work and found satisfaction in helping her students, she began to notice the systemic flaws that limited opportunities for women, especially in the field of education. She became increasingly frustrated with the idea that women could only teach, but not participate in the more intellectually demanding fields. This realization was pivotal in shaping her evolving views on the need for social reform. In 1849, Susan took a step that would alter the course of her life. She left her position at Canajoharie and moved to a new teaching job in the nearby town of Schoyler Falls. At this point in her life, she began to feel the weight of the gender-based restrictions that held women back from pursuing broader societal roles. As she navigated the world of teaching, she began to see firsthand how gender inequality affected women's choices and opportunities. This realization pushed her further into the belief that women deserve the same opportunities for education and public participation as men. During her time at Schoyler Falls, Susan became increasingly aware of the challenges facing women in general. She began questioning why her students, most of whom were girls, had fewer opportunities to pursue careers outside of the domestic sphere. Even those girls who excelled in academics were expected to marry and take on the role of a housewife. Susan, however, was beginning to see the broader social implications of this. She understood that the lack of educational opportunities for women directly contributed to their social subordination. In these years, Susan began to consider the broader implications of her work as a teacher. She began to reflect on how she could use her skills and position to advocate for women's rights. This was a critical turning point in her life, where the seeds of social activism began to take root in her. Her teaching career had shown her that education was not just about imparting knowledge, but also about nurturing independence and the ability to think critically about societal structures. At the same time, Susan's own education had expanded in important ways. She began to take an interest in the emerging abolitionist movement, which sought to end slavery in the United States. The cause of abolition became an important issue for her, and she started to align herself with prominent abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. Her involvement in the abolitionist movement broadened her perspective and reinforced her growing belief in equality for all people, regardless of race or gender. Susan's involvement with the abolitionist movement was a natural extension of her Quaker upbringing, which had instilled in her a deep sense of justice and compassion. She recognized that the fight for women's rights and the fight for abolition were deeply interconnected. In fact, Susan became increasingly convinced that true freedom and equality could only be achieved if both women and enslaved African Americans were granted full rights. However, despite her growing interest in social reform, Susan's personal life was still shaped by the limitations placed on women of her time. As a single woman who was independent and ambitious, Susan faced significant societal pressures to conform to the expected roles of women. These expectations, however, did little to deter her. She remained committed to her education and to advocating for the rights of others, even if it meant standing against the prevailing social norms. As Susan's views evolved, she became increasingly focused on the education and empowerment of women. She realized that the road to true equality for women lay in ensuring that they were given access to the same educational opportunities and public roles that men enjoyed. With this newfound clarity, Susan felt more determined than ever to continue her activism, even if it meant challenging the status quo in ways that were uncomfortable or controversial. Susan B. Anthony's teaching career, though short-lived, was crucial in shaping her belief in the transformative power of education. It was here, in the classroom, that she learned how essential education was to women's autonomy and empowerment. Her experiences as a teacher would continue to inform her work as a suffragist and social reformer in the years that followed. By 1851, Susan was ready to move beyond the classroom. She was no longer content to merely teach. She was driven by the desire to create broader social change. This period marked the beginning of her full-time involvement in social reform, as she would go on to spend the rest of her life fighting for women's rights, the abolition of slavery, and equality for all. In the early 1850s, Susan B. Anthony's life took a significant turn as she became increasingly involved in the abolitionist movement. Her experiences as a teacher, combined with her growing awareness of the systemic injustices facing both women and African Americans, drew her into the fight to end slavery in the United States. The abolition movement resonated deeply with Susan, and she came to see it as a natural extension of her own quest for equality and justice. As an abolitionist, Susan worked alongside prominent leaders such as William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman. She found herself aligned with their efforts to bring about the abolition of slavery, recognizing that the institution of slavery was one of the most egregious examples of human inequality. Susan's passion for social reform, which had been kindled during her years of teaching and reflection on women's rights, now found a powerful outlet in her advocacy for the abolition of slavery. The abolitionist movement of the 19th century was a growing force in the United States, and it brought together a diverse group of people who were committed to ending the system of slavery that had been entrenched in American society for centuries. Abolitionists, both black and white, men and women, worked tirelessly to raise awareness, organize campaigns, and push for legislative changes to free enslaved African Americans. Susan's involvement with the movement came at a time when tensions over slavery were beginning to escalate. The country was divided, with the North pushing for the abolition of slavery and the South fiercely defending the practice. The debates over slavery's morality and legality became increasingly heated, and the issue would eventually lead the nation into the Civil War. Though Susan B. Anthony is often remembered for her work in the women's suffrage movement, her abolitionist work was equally central to her life's purpose. She didn't see women's rights as a separate cause from the struggle for racial equality. To her, the two causes were inextricably linked. Both were about securing basic human rights for people who were systematically oppressed. She understood that the fight for women's suffrage and the fight to abolish slavery were both part of the larger battle to create a just and equitable society. In 1852, Susan began to travel more extensively, attending abolitionist conventions, speaking to audiences, and organizing petitions in favor of emancipation. She used her platform to speak out against the injustice of slavery, urging the country to take action. She was a passionate and eloquent speaker, and her presence in the abolitionist movement helped to bring attention to the plight of enslaved African Americans. One of Susan's most significant contributions to the abolitionist movement came in 1853, when she became involved with the New York State Anti-Slavery Society. This organization was one of the leading abolitionist groups in the state, and Susan's work with them gave her an opportunity to collaborate with other like-minded activists. She worked alongside notable figures in the movement, including the famous abolitionist orator and writer Frederick Douglass, who would later become one of her closest allies in the fight for women's suffrage. During this period, Susan also began to recognize the intersectionality of the struggles for women's rights and the abolition of slavery. She saw the ways in which women, particularly black women, were doubly oppressed, first by their gender and second by their race. This understanding deepened her resolve to work not just for the freedom of enslaved African Americans, but also for the freedom and equality of all women. In 1856, Susan B. Anthony attended the first National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts. While there, she made connections with other reformers who had become central figures in the women's suffrage movement, such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Although Susan was still very much involved in the abolitionist cause, she began to recognize the importance of focusing specifically on women's rights. This recognition marked the beginning of her shift toward the suffrage movement. Despite the shift in her focus, Susan remained committed to the abolitionist cause. She believed that the right to vote was not just a political issue, but a fundamental human right, and she saw the extension of the vote to African American men in the aftermath of the Civil War as a step in the right direction. However, she was deeply troubled by the fact that the 15th Amendment, which granted voting rights to black men, did not extend the same rights to women, a decision that would fuel her determination to fight for women's suffrage in the years to come. By the late 1850s, Susan B. Anthony's role in the abolitionist movement had solidified her as a prominent reformer, but she was not yet satisfied. The question of women's rights, particularly the right to vote, was beginning to occupy more and more of her time. Yet she understood that her work in the abolitionist movement was far from over. She continued to use her voice to speak out against the injustices of slavery, working to convince others of the importance of ending the institution of human bondage once and for all. The years leading up to the Civil War were crucial in shaping Susan B. Anthony's views on women's rights, social justice, and equality. The abolitionist movement served as a powerful training ground for the larger fight for women's suffrage, as Susan learned how to navigate the complexities of activism, political organizing, and social change. She saw firsthand the power of collective action, and she began to understand the depth of the changes needed in society to achieve true equality. Through her work with the abolitionist movement, Susan B. Anthony would later come to recognize the limitations of the laws and structures that governed society. She would come to understand that true freedom and equality required not only the end of slavery, but also the extension of rights to all people, regardless of gender or race. This insight would guide her as she turned her attention more fully to the fight for women's suffrage, a cause that would come to define the rest of her life. The year 1848 marked a turning point in the history of women's rights in the United States. It was the year that the first Women's Rights Convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York, an event that would change the course of history and ignite a nationwide movement for women's suffrage. Susan B. Anthony, although not yet directly involved, would soon be drawn into the growing fight for gender equality. The Seneca Falls Convention was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Two women who had become disillusioned with the restrictions placed on women, especially in their ability to speak and act within public and political spheres. It was a bold step in a time when most women were expected to stay within the domestic sphere, tending to household duties and raising children. The convention was a groundbreaking event. It brought together a diverse group of women and men who were committed to challenging the social norms that subjugated women. The attendees discussed a variety of topics related to women's rights, including education, property rights, and, most importantly, suffrage. The result was the Declaration of Sentiments, a document inspired by the Declaration of Independence that boldly proclaimed that all men and women are created equal. It demanded equal rights for women, including the right to vote. Though Susan B. Anthony did not attend the Seneca Falls Convention, the event had a profound impact on her. At the time, Susan was still primarily focused on the abolitionist movement, but she was becoming increasingly aware of the ways in which the struggles for women's rights and the abolition of slavery were intertwined. The Seneca Falls Convention, by calling attention to the systemic inequalities women faced, further solidified Susan's belief in the necessity of fighting for women's rights alongside her work in abolition. As Susan continued her work in the abolitionist movement, she began to form connections with those involved in the women's rights movement. In the years that followed, she would meet key figures in the suffrage movement, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who would become one of her closest allies and collaborators in the fight for women's suffrage. In 1851, 3 years after the Seneca Falls Convention, Susan B. Anthony attended a women's rights meeting where she first met Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Stanton, already a well-established figure in the women's rights movement, was immediately struck by Susan's intelligence, determination, and deep commitment to social justice. The two women quickly formed a strong bond, united by their shared vision for gender equality. In the early days of their partnership, Susan and Elizabeth faced significant challenges. The suffrage movement, though gaining momentum, was still considered a radical cause by many. Women who spoke publicly about their right to vote were often ridiculed, dismissed, or outright attacked. But neither Susan nor Elizabeth was deterred. The two women worked tirelessly to organize conventions, give speeches, and write articles advocating for women's suffrage. They were committed to challenging the existing norms and securing voting rights for women, and they were not afraid to push boundaries in their efforts. It was during this period that Susan B. Anthony became increasingly involved in the women's rights movement. Her deep belief in equality and her commitment to justice were the driving forces behind her advocacy for suffrage. She knew that women's voices had to be heard if true equality were to be achieved, and she was determined to do everything in her power to make that happen. While the Seneca Falls Convention had been a bold and groundbreaking moment, the road ahead for women's suffrage would be long and filled with opposition. However, the foundation laid by the convention would continue to inspire generations of women, including Susan B. Anthony, who would go on to become one of the most influential figures in the history of the suffrage movement. By the time Susan B. Anthony met Elizabeth Cady Stanton and became fully involved in the suffrage movement, she had already gained a reputation as a powerful and effective activist. She had spoken at numerous abolitionist conventions, organized petitions, and worked tirelessly to raise awareness about the plight of enslaved African Americans. Her work in the abolitionist movement had given her valuable experience in organizing, public speaking, and mobilizing people for social change, and she would apply these skills to the cause of women's suffrage. Susan's early experiences in the abolitionist movement also helped shape her views on the interconnectedness of the struggle for racial and gender equality. She understood that the fight for women's rights was part of a broader fight for human rights. To her, the two struggles were inseparable. The oppression of African Americans and the oppression of women were both rooted in the same system of inequality and discrimination. and she knew that she could not fight for the freedom and dignity of one group without fighting for the other. At the same time, Susan B. Anthony's commitment to the cause of women's suffrage would not come without challenges. As the movement gained traction, it faced increasing opposition from those who believed that women should remain in the domestic sphere and that the right to vote should be reserved for men. But Susan was undeterred. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she was committed to seeing the movement through. In the years following the Seneca Falls Convention, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton would become the two most prominent voices in the suffrage movement. Together they would organize conventions, write pamphlets, and give speeches in support of women's right to vote. And although the struggle for women's suffrage would not see immediate results, their work laid the groundwork for the eventual passage of the 19th Amendment. The legacy of the Seneca Falls Convention continued to inspire and guide Susan B. Anthony and her fellow suffragists as they fought for women's rights in the decades to come. The bold words of the Declaration of Sentiments, "All men and women are created equal," became a rallying cry for the suffrage movement, a reminder of the work that lay ahead and the ultimate goal of securing full equality for women. As the 1850s unfolded, Susan B. Anthony's advocacy for women's rights began to take on new dimensions. While she had initially focused much of her energy on the abolitionist cause, the growing movement for temperance, the restriction of alcohol consumption, presented another opportunity for her to champion social change. Temperance was seen as a pressing issue during this period, not only for its social implications but also because it directly affected the lives of women and children. In the mid-19th century, alcohol abuse was rampant, especially among men. Many women found themselves trapped in abusive marriages, unable to escape the grasp of alcohol-fueled violence and financial instability. For women, alcohol abuse became a dangerous and often deadly threat, with men frequently spending their earnings on liquor rather than supporting their families. This became a deeply personal issue for many women who saw the temperance movement as a means of safeguarding their homes, their safety, and their futures. Susan B. Anthony recognized that temperance was not just about banning alcohol. It was about empowering women to take control of their lives and protect their families. It was an issue that resonated with her commitment to gender equality and the protection of women's rights. As she had done with the abolitionist cause, Susan joined the fight for temperance with the same fervor and sense of justice. In 1852, Susan B. Anthony helped to found the New York Women's State Temperance Society, an organization dedicated to advocating for the prohibition of alcohol. The society worked to raise awareness about the damaging effects of alcohol on families and communities. It sought to provide a platform for women to speak out about the violence and hardship that resulted from alcohol consumption, and to push for laws that would limit the availability of alcohol. While the temperance movement initially seemed unrelated to the fight for women's suffrage, Susan soon recognized that both causes were deeply interconnected. Women's dependence on men's behavior, whether in terms of financial support or protection from violence, was directly tied to the gender norms of the time. In a society where women were often seen as the property of their husbands, the temperance movement became one more avenue through which women could fight for control over their own lives. Susan's work in the temperance movement introduced her to new audiences and broadened her activism. She began to realize that the fight for women's rights could not be limited to a single issue, but must encompass a wide range of societal injustices. The temperance movement was a gateway to a broader understanding of women's rights, as it gave Susan the opportunity to speak out against gender-based violence and the limitations placed on women's roles in society. At the same time, the temperance movement presented an additional challenge for Susan. It was a movement that was largely led by men. Though women were increasingly involved in advocating for temperance, the leadership roles within the movement were still occupied by men. This presented Susan with an opportunity to demonstrate her own leadership and to challenge the gendered assumptions that kept women from fully participating in social reform. Susan began to speak more frequently in public about temperance, giving speeches and organizing rallies. Her ability to capture an audience with her calm, measured tone and unwavering commitment to justice made her an effective advocate. But more importantly, her participation in the temperance movement allowed her to cultivate relationships with other reformers, many of whom would go on to become allies in the fight for women's suffrage. Through her work with the New York Women's State Temperance Society, Susan B. Anthony became a more visible figure in the broader social reform movement. She was gaining recognition not only for her activism in the temperance movement, but also for her staunch belief in the rights of women to take their place in the public sphere. This suffrage movement, which had been a secondary focus for Susan up until this point, was now beginning to take on more significance in her life. As she continued to work in both the abolitionist and temperance movements, Susan's resolve to fight for women's suffrage grew stronger. She saw that the rights of women, particularly their right to vote, were directly connected to their ability to influence the laws and systems that governed their lives. For Susan, suffrage was not just about giving women a voice in politics. It was about giving them control over their own destinies, about giving them the ability to protect their homes and families from the harms of alcohol, violence, and inequality. While Susan was busy organizing and advocating for temperance, she never lost sight of the larger goal of women's rights. She began to see the ways in which the different movements she was involved in intersected. The abolition of slavery, the fight for temperance, and the battle for women's suffrage were all part of a broader struggle to create a just and equal society, one where all people, regardless of gender or race, could live free from oppression and exploitation. The formation of the New York Women's State Temperance Society and Susan B. Anthony's leadership in it marked an important stage in her activism. It allowed her to connect with other reformers, to develop her public speaking skills, and to further her understanding of the ways in which social change could be achieved. But more importantly, it reaffirmed her belief that women's rights were a fundamental issue that could not be ignored. The temperance movement provided Susan with the tools and platform she needed to expand her advocacy, setting the stage for her future work in the suffrage movement. As the 1860s approached, Susan B. Anthony's involvement in the temperance movement had firmly established her as one of the leading figures in the fight for women's rights. Her ability to bring attention to social injustices, combined with her dedication to challenging gender norms, made her a powerful voice for change. But the coming decade would bring new challenges and new opportunities for Susan, as she fully turned her attention to the cause that would come to define her life: women's suffrage. The formation of the National Woman Suffrage Association, NWSA, in 1869 marked a pivotal moment in Susan B. Anthony's life, as it solidified her commitment to the cause of women's suffrage and formalized her role as one of its leading advocates. In the wake of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th and 14th Amendments, which granted freedom and citizenship to formerly enslaved African Americans, Susan was faced with a new challenge. The struggle for women's suffrage now had to contend with the fact that black men had gained the right to vote while women remained disenfranchised. This political moment prompted a major division within the suffrage movement. While many suffragists believed the passage of the 15th Amendment, which granted voting rights to African American men, should be celebrated, Susan B. Anthony and her ally, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, were deeply disheartened by the exclusion of women from the franchise. The 15th Amendment, which granted voting rights regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, left women, half of the population, without the right to vote. In response to the limitations imposed by the 15th Amendment, Anthony and Stanton founded the National Woman Suffrage Association, NWSA. The goal of the NWSA was clear. It would fight for the right of women to vote, with an emphasis on securing a national suffrage amendment. This was a major turning point for Susan. The NWSA would be her primary vehicle for pursuing the cause of women's suffrage, and it would be an organisation she would work tirelessly for in the coming decades. The NWSA was founded on the principles of equality and inclusion. Stanton and Anthony believed that suffrage was central to women's liberation, and they worked tirelessly to push for change. Their campaign would focus on persuading Congress to pass a federal suffrage amendment, one that would guarantee voting rights for women nationwide. This was an ambitious goal, and the fight would not be easy. However, the NWSA was not the only suffrage organisation advocating for women's right to vote. In 1869, another suffrage group, the American Woman Suffrage Association, AWSA, was also formed, primarily led by Lucy Stone, Henry Blackwell, and other suffragists who believed in a more gradual state-by-state approach. The AWSA was less confrontational than the NWSA, and its members preferred to work within existing political structures to win women's suffrage on a state-by-state basis. This split between the two organizations reflected a key strategic divide within the suffrage movement, one that would persist for decades. Susan B., Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, along with their NWSA colleagues, believed in a more radical approach, advocating for a constitutional amendment to guarantee women's right to vote. Conversely, the AWSA believed that women could gain the right to vote through state-by-state campaigns, allowing them to gradually build momentum without a single national push. The leadership of the NWSA was marked by Susan's unparalleled energy and vision. Her determination to win women's suffrage at the national level led her to campaign tirelessly across the country, speaking at conventions, writing articles, and working to build support for a constitutional amendment. Stanton and Anthony were an effective team. Stanton was a brilliant writer and speaker, while Anthony's organizational and public speaking skills made her the face of the movement. In the early years of the NWSA, Susan's activism reached new heights. She spoke at suffrage conventions, rallying supporters with her powerful words and commitment to equality. Her speeches were filled with the urgency of the cause. She understood that women's suffrage was not just about voting, but about securing full citizenship and equality. She argued that without the right to vote, women would continue to be marginalized in society, unable to participate fully in the political process. Despite the tireless efforts of the NWSA, however, the struggle for women's suffrage remained an uphill battle. The political climate of the time was still deeply entrenched in traditional gender roles, and the notion of women having the right to vote was still considered radical and unacceptable by many. Suffragists were often ridiculed, dismissed, or even attacked for their beliefs, but Susan B. Anthony's determination never wavered. She was undeterred by the opposition and continued her efforts to win support for the suffrage cause. Her work with the NWSA was not just about securing the right to vote. It was about ensuring that women had the same opportunities, the same rights, and the same voice as men in all matters of public life. In 1872, Susan took a bold and defiant step by attempting to vote in the presidential election, an act that would lead to her arrest and trial. At the time, women were not allowed to vote, but Susan believed that the laws restricting women's participation in elections were unjust and needed to be challenged. She was arrested for voting, but she refused to pay the fine, using the trial as a platform to speak out for women's rights. This act of civil disobedience would become a defining moment in her activism and would inspire generations of women to fight for their rights. As the years went on, the NWSA continued to advocate for the suffrage movement, organizing petitions, holding meetings, and garnering support for their cause. Though progress was slow, the NWSA's efforts were not in vain. Their work laid the groundwork for the eventual passage of the 19th Amendment, which would secure women's right to vote in 1920. Susan B. Anthony's leadership in the NWSA, alongside Elizabeth Cady Stanton, would make her one of the most iconic figures in the suffrage movement. Through their tireless advocacy and unwavering commitment to justice, they helped to bring about one of the most significant social changes in American history: the recognition of women as full and equal citizens with the right to vote. The 1870s and 1880s were pivotal decades for Susan B. Anthony and the women's suffrage movement. In this period, Susan and her fellow suffragists faced increasing resistance from all sides, but their resolve remained unshaken. As the movement gained visibility, Susan's leadership and determination continued to propel the cause forward. Despite setbacks and disappointments, the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, granted African American men the right to vote, but it left women, regardless of race, still excluded from the ballot. This omission deeply frustrated Susan B., Anthony and other women's rights advocates, especially after their involvement in the abolitionist movement. Women like Susan had worked alongside abolitionists to secure freedom and citizenship for enslaved African Americans, yet they were denied the same rights. This injustice strengthened their belief that gender equality was equally urgent as racial equality. In the early 1870s, Susan, along with fellow suffragist Elizabeth Cady Stanton, set out to challenge the legal framework that denied women the right to vote. One of the most memorable and bold actions occurred in 1872, when Susan B. Anthony, despite the laws restricting women from voting, decided to cast her vote in the presidential election. She was arrested for her act of civil disobedience, an event that would become a defining moment in her life. The trial that followed was a platform for her to speak out against the injustice of disenfranchisement. Although she was fined $100, Susan refused to pay the fine, using her legal troubles as an opportunity to call attention to the suffrage movement. Her arrest, trial, and refusal to pay the fine made national headlines and helped bring attention to the suffrage movement. The trial was a critical moment in the history of women's rights, and Susan's courageous actions sparked a new wave of activism in the suffrage campaign. Yet, despite her efforts, the legal system continued to block women's suffrage. This only strengthened Susan's resolve, as she understood that the battle would require continued persistence and a long-term strategy. During this period, Susan also began to refine her approach to activism. While she'd been involved in a variety of social reform movements, including abolitionism and temperance, it was clear that securing women's suffrage was the central cause of her life. Susan's work in the suffrage movement was no longer just about education or advocacy. It became about organizing, strategic planning, and rallying support at the local, state, and national levels. Through the 1870s and 1880s, Susan continued to speak at conventions, hold rallies, and organize campaigns in support of women's right to vote. However, despite the tireless efforts of the suffragists, the movement struggled to gain significant legislative victories. Many women were still too afraid to challenge the societal norms that excluded them from the voting process. Opposition to women's suffrage came from powerful quarters, including political leaders, religious institutions, and even women who believed that women should not engage in the political sphere. Susan B., Anthony and her colleagues, including Stanton, began to realize that their strategy needed to evolve. They shifted from simply petitioning for women's suffrage to a more organized effort to push for state-by-state victories. As Susan traveled from state to state, she began to see the potential for progress at the state level, where local campaigns could help build momentum for a larger national effort. The fight for women's suffrage, however, remained slow and difficult, but in 1878, the introduction of the first federal suffrage amendment in Congress, though unsuccessful, marked the beginning of a concerted effort to secure a national right to vote for women. Despite setbacks, Susan's belief in the righteousness of the cause never wavered. Her ability to remain steady in the face of opposition became one of the defining characteristics of her activism. She worked alongside other suffragists, such as Lucy Stone, Susan's fellow suffragist leader, who had a different state-based approach. Over time, the two groups, despite differences in strategy, worked together to advocate for women's rights. Susan's unyielding belief in the necessity of suffrage gave her an almost tireless energy, even as she faced personal challenges. In the 1880s, as the movement expanded and gained more attention, Susan's work began to include more national and international collaboration. She helped to establish the International Woman Suffrage Alliance, IWSA, in 1888, further expanding the global network of suffrage activists. She and her allies recognized that women's suffrage was not just an American issue. It was part of a global struggle for women's rights and equality. The IWSA represented a significant step in connecting suffragists across countries, showing that women's right to vote was a cause that transcended national borders. Throughout the campaigns of the 1870s and 1880s, Susan B. Anthony was a tireless advocate both in speeches and in writing. She published and spoke on the subject of women's suffrage frequently, making the case for why it was necessary for women to have the right to vote in order to secure equal rights in all other spheres of life. She argued that without the vote, women would remain powerless in the political process, unable to effect change in areas such as education, labour laws, and domestic violence. Despite the slow progress, the movement gained allies and saw incremental victories in some states. In some parts of the country, women won the right to vote in local elections, and suffrage campaigns in individual states began to take off, marking small victories that would eventually add up to a larger, more widespread push for national suffrage. By the end of the 1880s, the suffrage movement was on the brink of a new phase. The foundations laid by Susan B. Anthony and her colleagues in the 1870s and 1880s would soon lead to the momentum needed to secure the eventual passage of the 19th Amendment. The path to victory, however, remained long and uncertain, but the work done in these years laid the groundwork for the final push that would come in the 20th century. In 1872, Susan B. Anthony took a bold and courageous step that would become one of the most significant acts of defiance in the history of the women's suffrage movement. At a time when women were still not allowed to vote in the United States, Susan decided to cast her ballot in the presidential election. She was arrested for her actions, and the trial that followed became a defining moment in her lifelong fight for women's rights. The political climate of the time was one in which women's suffrage was still a radical idea. The country was still deeply entrenched in patriarchal norms, and the notion that women should have the right to vote was seen by many as a threat to the social order. Despite this, Susan B. Anthony and other suffragists continued to fight for the recognition of women's right to vote. They understood that securing this right was crucial to achieving full equality and citizenship for women. On November 5, 1872, Susan B. Anthony registered to vote in Rochester, New York, despite knowing that the law prohibited women from voting. She, along with a group of other women, went to the polling station and cast their ballots in the presidential election. Anthony believed that the 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to all persons, including former slaves, also granted women the right to vote. She argued that the right to vote was inherent in the principles of equality and liberty outlined in the Constitution. Susan's act of civil disobedience was met with swift and severe consequences. Just days after voting, she was arrested. The arrest was a clear indication of the lengths to which the government would go to maintain the status quo. The authorities saw her actions as a direct challenge to the legal framework that excluded women from the political process. Susan, however, saw her arrest as a necessary step in exposing the injustice of women's disenfranchisement. The trial that followed was a spectacle that drew significant attention to the suffrage movement. Susan B. Anthony's trial was an opportunity for her to present her case for women's rights to a national audience. It was a rare moment in history when a woman was able to stand up in a court of law and argue for the equality of women in the public sphere. During the trial, Susan's defense was clear and unapologetic. She argued that the Constitution guaranteed women the right to vote, and she refused to accept the idea that her actions had been illegal. Despite the strength of her arguments, the trial ended in a predictable verdict. The judge, Judge Ward Hunt, ruled that Susan B. Anthony was guilty of voting illegally and fined her $100. However, Susan refused to pay the fine. She knew that paying the fine would be an admission of guilt, and she was unwilling to concede that women's rights were less important than the rights of men. Her refusal to pay the fine became an act of defiance that further highlighted her commitment to the suffrage cause. The trial and the events surrounding it had a profound impact on the suffrage movement. While the outcome was not what Susan had hoped for, her actions brought national attention to the issue of women's rights. The media coverage of her trial helped to raise awareness about the injustice of women being denied the right to vote. The trial also solidified Susan B. Anthony's reputation as one of the leading voices of the suffrage movement. In the years that followed, Susan B. Anthony continued her tireless advocacy for women's rights. The trial, though it did not result in immediate legal change, demonstrated the power of civil disobedience and highlighted the injustice of women's exclusion from the political process. Susan's courage and unwavering belief in equality helped to inspire future generations of women to take up the cause of women's suffrage. For Susan, the trial was not just a personal battle. It was part of a larger struggle for justice and equality. She knew that the road to securing women's right to vote would be long and difficult, but she was undeterred. Her trial had made it clear that the legal system would not easily grant women the rights they deserved. But it had also shown that women were willing to fight for their freedom and equality. In the years after the trial, Susan continued her efforts to secure the right to vote for women. Her tireless advocacy, coupled with her willingness to stand up for what she believed in, became a model for other suffragists who followed in her footsteps. She continued to organize conventions, give speeches, and publish writings on the importance of women's suffrage. Though she did not live to see the full realization of her dream, Susan B. Anthony's contributions to the suffrage movement were invaluable. Her actions in 1872, her trial, and her refusal to back down in the face of adversity helped lay the groundwork for the eventual passage of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote in 1920. Susan's legacy as a trailblazer for women's rights remains one of the most significant in American history. By the late 1880s, the suffrage movement had gained significant momentum, but it remained divided. Two primary factions had emerged: the National Woman Suffrage Association, NWSA, led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and the American Woman Suffrage Association, AWSA, led by Lucy Stone and others. While the NWSA focused on securing women's suffrage through a national amendment, the AWS took a more gradual approach, seeking suffrage through state-by-state campaigns. For nearly 2 decades, these two groups worked separately, each pursuing its own strategy, but they eventually realized that unity was necessary to make any significant headway. The suffrage movement had long been fragmented, and Susan B. Anthony and her colleagues understood that only by coming together could they present a united front to Congress and the American public. In 1890, the two factions of the suffrage movement officially united to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association, NATWSA, a new organization that would combine the strengths of both approaches. The merging of the NWSA and AWSA was a major achievement for the suffrage movement, and it represented a turning point in the fight for women's voting rights. The goal of the newly formed NAWSA was clear: to secure a federal constitutional amendment granting women the right to vote. The unification of the two organizations was not without its challenges, as the different factions had differing strategies and ideas about how to achieve suffrage. The NWSA, under Susan B., Anthony's leadership was committed to a direct federal amendment, while the AWSA, led by Lucy Stone, focused on a state-by-state approach. Despite these differences, both groups shared a common goal, and they recognized that their combined efforts would have a far greater impact than if they continued to work separately. The formation of the NAWSA marked a new chapter in the suffrage movement, and Susan B. Anthony's role in the unification process was crucial. She was a tireless advocate for women's rights, and her leadership helped to bring together the fragmented suffrage factions. Susan's deep belief in the importance of unity and her strategic vision were key in forging the alliance between the NWSA and the AWSA. As the newly unified NAWSA began to focus its efforts on securing the vote for women, Susan B. Anthony's leadership continued to be a driving force in the organization. However, at this stage in her life she was in her 70s, and her health was beginning to decline. Still, she remained active in the suffrage movement, travelling across the country to give speeches and advocate for the cause. Her tireless work and commitment to suffrage continued to inspire suffragists across the country. Despite the unification of the two organisations, the road to women's suffrage was far from easy. The NAWSA faced significant opposition from both men and women who believed that women should not have the right to vote. Many political leaders and religious figures continued to argue that women's place was in the home, and that giving them the vote would upset the natural order of society. Despite this opposition, the NAWSA continued to build support for the suffrage cause, and its membership grew steadily. In the years following the formation of the NAWSA, Susan B., Anthony and her colleagues worked tirelessly to raise awareness about women's suffrage. The organisation organised conventions, held rallies, and published articles in newspapers to spread the message that women deserved the right to vote. Their work was not without its challenges, as they faced constant resistance from those who opposed women's suffrage. But the suffragists' determination and persistence began to bear fruit. The late 19th century was a time of growing social reform movements, and the suffrage movement was gaining traction. More and more women were becoming involved in the fight for suffrage, and their voices began to be heard in the political arena. While the suffrage movement had not yet achieved its ultimate goal, the formation of the NAWSA represented a major step forward, and it laid the groundwork for future victories. The unification of the NWSA and the AWSA was a significant turning point in Susan B. Anthony's life and in the history of the suffrage movement. It marked the beginning of a new era of cooperation and collective action among suffragists, and it set the stage for the eventual passage of the 19th Amendment. As Susan B. Anthony continued her work with the NAWSA, her influence grew even greater. She became a symbol of the suffrage movement, a figure whose name was synonymous with the fight for women's rights. Her tireless advocacy, her strategic thinking, and her unyielding commitment to justice made her one of the most important figures in the history of the United States. However, as the years passed, Susan's health continued to decline. By the late 1890s, she was no longer able to travel as extensively as she had in her earlier years. But her work was far from over. She continued to work behind the scenes, offering advice, writing letters, and supporting younger suffragists in their efforts. As the 20th century dawned, the suffrage movement was on the cusp of a new era. The formation of the NAWSA and the unification of the suffrage movement marked a critical moment in the long struggle for women's rights. Susan B. Anthony's leadership and vision had laid the foundation for the eventual victory of women's suffrage, but the final push for women's right to vote would come in the years that followed. driven by the work of both the older suffragists like Susan and a new generation of activists. As Susan B. Anthony entered her 70s, her work in the suffrage movement was as relentless as ever, but her physical health began to decline. The tireless work she had dedicated to securing women's right to vote took its toll on her body, and she faced increasing physical challenges. Yet even as she struggled with her health, her determination to see women gain the right to vote remained unwavering. The 1890s were a period of reflection for Susan. Though she had been deeply involved in the suffrage movement for decades, she knew that time was not on her side. Yet rather than slowing down, Susan intensified her efforts, knowing that her leadership was still needed. She continued to travel across the country, giving speeches and rallying support for the suffrage cause, though with increasing difficulty. Her body was frail, but her mind remained sharp, and her passion for the cause never faltered. By the mid-1890s, Susan had become an icon of the suffrage movement. Her name was synonymous with the fight for women's rights, and she was widely respected by suffragists and non-suffragists alike for her unwavering commitment. However, as she grew older, she faced the inevitable realities of aging. Her health began to deteriorate, and she had to take more frequent rests. Despite her declining health, Susan's spirit remained unbroken, and she continued to work behind the scenes, supporting younger suffragists and offering her guidance and advice. In 1896, Susan B. Anthony suffered a serious illness, which forced her to scale back her public appearances. This was a difficult time for her, as she had always been a tireless worker, constantly on the move to advance the suffrage cause. Yet, even in her weakened state, Susan never gave up on her mission. She continued to correspond with suffragists and encourage their work, even though she could no longer be as physically active as she had been in her prime. During this period, Susan also began to reflect on the progress of the suffrage movement and her role within it. She had spent much of her life advocating for women's right to vote, and while she had seen some victories, such as the growing number of states granting women the right to vote in local elections, she knew that the ultimate victory was still far from reach. The 19th Amendment, which would grant women the right to vote nationwide, seemed like a distant dream. Despite the long road ahead, Susan continued to believe in the eventual success of the suffrage movement. She was heartened by the work of younger suffragists, such as Carrie Chapman Catt, who were taking on leadership roles within the suffrage organisations. These younger activists brought new energy and fresh ideas to the cause, and Susan was deeply impressed by their commitment and determination. She saw in them the future of the movement and was encouraged by their drive to continue the work she had started. As the 1900s began, Susan B. Anthony was nearing the end of her life. She had lived through remarkable times, witnessing the transformation of the suffrage movement from a radical cause to one that was increasingly gaining mainstream support. Yet, despite the long years of effort, Susan still had not seen the success she had worked so hard for. The 19th Amendment, which would grant women the right to vote, was not yet a reality. In 1905, as Susan approached her 85th birthday, her health began to rapidly decline. She had devoted her entire life to the cause of women's suffrage, and the weight of her years of hard work began to take its toll. However, her commitment to the suffrage movement remained steadfast. Even as her health deteriorated, Susan continued to meet with suffragists and offer her advice, determined to see the fight through to the end. Susan's final years were marked by a sense of quiet reflection. She'd given so much of herself to the suffrage movement, and she'd seen significant progress, yet the final victory remained elusive. Nevertheless, Susan remained optimistic. She knew that the work she had done had paved the way for the eventual success of the suffrage movement. She also took comfort in the fact that she had inspired countless others to continue the fight. As the 1900s progressed, the suffrage movement continued to build momentum. the states that had granted women the right to vote in local elections were beginning to see the positive effects of women's participation in politics. More and more women were becoming involved in public life, and the demand for a national suffrage amendment grew louder. The suffrage movement, though it had faced decades of resistance, was finally beginning to gain the support it needed to secure victory. In early 1906, Susan B. Anthony's health worsened. She had lived a long and fulfilling life, but the end was now near. She passed away quietly on March 13th, 1906, at the age of 86. Though she did not live to see the passage of the 19th Amendment, Susan's death did not mark the end of the suffrage movement. Her legacy lived on in the work of those who continued to fight for women's rights. Susan B. Anthony's passing was a moment of profound sadness for the suffrage movement, but it also served as a reminder of the incredible impact she had made. Her work had laid the groundwork for the eventual success of the suffrage movement, and her name would forever be associated with the fight for women's rights. Though she did not live to cast her vote, Susan B. Anthony had ensured that future generations of women would have the right to do so. Susan B. Anthony passed away on March 13th, 1906 at the age of 86, leaving behind a monumental legacy. Her death marked the end of an era for the women's suffrage movement. Yet it also symbolized the profound change she had helped bring to the United States. Though she did not live to see the ultimate success of her life's work, her passing was a bittersweet moment of reflection for those who had fought beside her and for those who would carry the torch forward. In the years leading up to her death, Susan had continued to remain deeply committed to the suffrage movement. Even in her declining health, she travelled when possible, offering support, advice, and encouragement to the next generation of activists. Susan's influence had spread beyond the borders of the United States, inspiring suffragists around the world. Her name was synonymous with the cause of women's rights, and her tireless work had ensured that women's suffrage was no longer a fringe issue. When news of Susan B. Anthony's death reached the suffrage movement, it was met with a mixture of grief and resolve. Susan had been the embodiment of the struggle for women's right to vote for over 50 years. Her leadership, her speeches, her writings, and her sacrifices had given the movement a face and a voice. Her passing was a loss for all who had worked alongside her, but it also served as a rallying cry for those who remained. Anthony's death was not just mourned in the suffrage circles, it was widely acknowledged across the country. Leaders from all walks of life, many of whom had opposed women's suffrage for years, took a moment to reflect on her contributions. It was a testament to the depth of her impact that even her opponents could not ignore her significance. They recognized that Susan B. Anthony had become a symbol of persistence, a reminder of the lengths to which one person could go to make the world more just. In the wake of her death, many suffrage leaders, including Carrie Chapman Catt and Anna Howard Shaw, took up the mantle of leadership within the suffrage movement. Catt, in particular, would become the face of the movement in the years following Susan's death. Her ability to galvanize support for women's suffrage was crucial in the final push for the passage of the 19th Amendment. Catt and other suffragists frequently acknowledged Susan B. Anthony as the founding mother of their cause, and they credited much of the movement's success to the foundation she had laid. Although Susan B. Anthony did not live to see women gain the right to vote, her death helped focus the suffrage movement on its ultimate goal. Her passing was a poignant reminder that while the battle for women's suffrage had been long and difficult, the fight had not yet been won. The urgency of her cause remained ever present, even in her absence. At the time of Susan's death, only a handful of states had granted women the right to vote in certain elections, and many suffrage leaders knew that the fight for full suffrage on a national level would continue. Yet the groundwork for success had already been laid. Susan's death acted as a catalyst for the suffrage movement, galvanizing activists and encouraging them to redouble their efforts to pass a federal amendment. The funeral of Susan B. Anthony was attended by many of her closest friends and allies, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was herself frail but determined to honor the woman who'd been her partner in the suffrage movement for decades. The ceremony was one of somber reflection and deep respect for Anthony's contributions. Women especially mourned the loss of a champion who had fought for their rights for more than half a century. Susan B. Anthony's legacy, however, did not end with her death. Over the next several years, the suffrage movement continued to gain ground, and it was clear that her vision was being realized. The cause that Susan had fought for so passionately, women's right to vote, was finally gaining traction. More states began to grant women the right to vote, and the momentum for a national amendment increased. In 1919, 13 years after Susan B. Anthony's death, the 19th Amendment was finally passed by Congress. The amendment granted women the right to vote in all elections, securing a victory that Susan B. Anthony had worked her entire life for. It was a victory that she had fought for through years of struggle, through arrests, through personal sacrifice, and through relentless perseverance. Although she did not live to see the day of its passage, the 19th Amendment was a testament to her life's work. Susan B. Anthony's passing was a moment of profound sorrow, but it also marked the culmination of a century-long struggle for equality. Her death was a reminder of the sacrifices made by countless women and men who had fought for women's rights. It also inspired a renewed commitment to the cause, pushing suffragists to achieve the final victory that had eluded them for so long. As the suffrage movement celebrated the passage of the 19th Amendment, they also honored the memory of Susan B. Anthony, the woman who had given her life to the fight for women's equality. Her legacy lived on in the generations of women who voted for the first time, in the political changes that followed, and in the hearts and minds of those who believed in equality for all people, regardless of gender. In the years following Susan B. Anthony's death in 1906, the momentum for women's suffrage only grew stronger. Her passing, though a time of great sadness for those who had worked alongside her, became a catalyst for renewed efforts. Anthony's lifetime of advocacy for women's rights had laid the foundation for the final push toward the ultimate victory that she had dreamed of. In the decade following her death, suffragists were more determined than ever to see through the changes that Susan had fought for so tirelessly. Following Susan's death, suffrage leaders like Carrie Chapman Catt and Anna Howard Shaw took up the mantle of leadership within the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA. Both women were deeply influenced by Susan's pioneering work in organizing the suffrage movement, and they carried forward her vision with unwavering determination. Susan's legacy lived on through them, and their leadership would be essential in pushing the suffrage movement to its final triumph. Carrie Chapman Catt, in particular, was instrumental in revitalizing the suffrage cause during these years. She recognized that while the struggle for women's voting rights had already been long and arduous, there was now a real chance to win at the national level. Catt worked tirelessly to rally support from both grassroots suffragists and influential political figures. By focusing on a well-coordinated national campaign, she helped position the suffrage movement for success. The early 20th century saw significant political changes that contributed to the growing support for women's suffrage. More states granted women the right to vote, and by 1910, Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, and Utah had already extended suffrage to women. These victories at the state level were key in building momentum for a national amendment. The successes in these western states helped shift public opinion across the country, and demonstrated that women could participate effectively in the political process. During this period, the suffrage movement also gained increased support from labor organizations and progressive political groups. The progressive era of the early 20th century was marked by a growing awareness of social justice issues, including women's rights. The push for women's suffrage became part of a larger movement for labour reforms, better working conditions, and expanded social rights. Suffragists were able to align their cause with broader social justice goals, making their arguments even more compelling to a wider audience. Suffragists also began to strategically appeal to the growing power of women's influence as consumers and citizens. With the rise of women in the workforce, especially in industries like textiles and teaching, the suffrage movement gained support from working women who wanted a voice in the political decisions that affected their lives. These new voices added strength to the campaign and helped shift the national narrative on women's role in society. While the fight for suffrage was gaining ground, it was also becoming increasingly clear that a national victory was needed to secure women's right to vote. The piecemeal success at the state level was important, but Susan B. Anthony had always believed that only a federal amendment would guarantee equal voting rights for women. Her death had left this goal incomplete, but the suffrage movement, energized by her legacy, continued the push for a constitutional amendment. In the years after her death, the suffrage movement also began to gain the attention of the federal government. President Theodore Roosevelt, known for his progressive policies, began to express his support for women's suffrage. Roosevelt's endorsement was a significant step, signaling to the American public that women's suffrage was a legitimate political issue that could no longer be ignored. His support gave the suffrage movement a new sense of legitimacy, and it helped to shift the debate in favor of women's rights. One of the most significant milestones during this period was the formation of the National Woman's Party, NWP, in 1916, led by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. The NWP took a more militant approach to suffrage, employing direct action tactics such as picketing and staging protests outside the White House. While the NWP's tactics were often more controversial than those of the NAWSA, their efforts helped to further publicize the suffrage cause and brought greater urgency to the movement. The visibility of these protests captured the attention of both the media and the public, and it became clear that the suffrage movement was now a force to be reckoned with. In 1917, as the movement continued to gain traction, the NWP organized the first ever picket line in front of the White House. These women stood outside the gates holding banners and demanding that President Wilson and Congress pass a national suffrage amendment. Their bravery and determination, despite being met with hostility and even arrest, garnered widespread attention and pushed the suffrage movement to the forefront of American politics. By 1918, the suffrage movement had reached its zenith. The passage of the 19th Amendment was within sight. The federal government could no longer ignore the demands of suffragists, who'd been fighting for more than 70 years. The tide of public opinion had shifted, and women's suffrage was no longer seen as a radical fringe issue. It had become a national cause, supported by a growing number of Americans, and political leaders realized that granting women the right to vote was a matter of fairness and justice. In 1919, Congress passed the 19th Amendment, and it was ratified the following year, securing women's right to vote in all elections. The passage of the amendment was the culmination of a long and arduous struggle, and it was a victory that Susan B. Anthony had worked for her entire life. Though she did not live to see it, her contributions to the movement were integral to its success. The years following Susan B. Anthony's death were a time of great progress for the suffrage movement. The tireless work of suffragists, the growing support from the public, and the political changes of the early 20th century all played a role in the ultimate victory. Susan B. Anthony's legacy lived on in the women who continued to fight for equality, and in the millions of women who, for the first time, cast their votes in the 1920 elections. The passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920 marked the culmination of over 70 years of struggle by suffragists like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and countless others who had devoted their lives to securing voting rights for women. While Susan B. Anthony did not live to see the fruits of her labor, her tireless advocacy and commitment to the cause had laid the foundation for the historic achievement. In 1919, after decades of relentless campaigning, the suffrage movement saw its efforts begin to bear fruit when Congress passed the 19th Amendment, which guaranteed women the right to vote. The amendment passed with significant bipartisan support, reflecting the growing recognition that women's suffrage was no longer a fringe issue, but a matter of equality and justice. The passage of the amendment in Congress was a historic moment, one that marked the end of a long and difficult battle for women's rights. The 19th Amendment states, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." This simple yet powerful sentence signified the victory of suffragists who had fought for decades to ensure that women would be treated as equal citizens in the political process. It was a landmark achievement, not only for women but for the entire nation. Though the amendment passed through Congress in 1919, it still needed to be ratified by 3/4 of the states before it could become law. The final push for ratification came in the summer of 1920, when the suffrage movement turned its attention to the states. After much campaigning and lobbying, the final state needed for ratification, Tennessee, cast the decisive vote on August 18, 1920, officially granting women the right to vote across the nation. The passing of the 19th Amendment was a moment of tremendous celebration for suffragists. However, the women who had fought for this moment, those like Susan B. Anthony, who had devoted their lives to the cause, were not present to witness the historic victory. Susan B. Anthony had passed away 14 years earlier, in 1906, and while she'd seen some progress in the suffrage movement, she did not live to see the final triumph. Despite her absence, Susan's legacy loomed large. She had been one of the most visible and relentless voices for women's rights, tirelessly organizing, speaking, and advocating for the right of women to vote. Her work laid the foundation for the achievements that came after her death, and her name became synonymous with the suffrage movement. The suffragists who had worked alongside Susan B. Anthony, like Carrie Chapman Catt, were deeply aware of the debt they owed to the women who had fought before them. Carrie Chapman Catt, who became the president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, NAWSA, after Susan's death, was instrumental in the final push for the 19th Amendment. Catt's strategy of focusing on both national and state-level campaigns helped garner widespread support for the cause. While the passage of the 19th Amendment was a victory, it was not without its challenges and complications. Although the amendment granted women the right to vote, many black women, particularly in the South, still face significant barriers to voting due to discriminatory laws, voter literacy tests, and other obstacles designed to disenfranchise African Americans. These challenges would persist for many years, and the fight for voting rights for all women continued after 1920. Nonetheless, the 19th Amendment marked a critical turning point in the ongoing struggle for civil rights and equality in the United States. In the immediate aftermath of the amendment's passage, suffragists celebrated their hard-won victory. The suffrage movement had successfully altered the fabric of American democracy, securing for women the right to participate in the political process. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and other suffrage leaders had laid the groundwork for this success through decades of hard work, despite the personal sacrifices they had made along the way. Susan B. Anthony's influence remained a driving force in the early 20th century, even after her death. Her image and her name became symbols of the suffrage movement, and her work continued to inspire those who carried on the fight for women's rights. In 1920, shortly after the passage of the 19th Amendment, Susan B. Anthony became the first woman to be honored with a statue in the U.S. Capitol. This tribute to her enduring legacy was a fitting recognition of her contribution to the struggle for women's equality. The passage of the 19th Amendment was a profound achievement for women, but it was also a reminder of the persistence and resilience of the women who had fought for it. For those who had spent their lives fighting for women's suffrage, the victory was not just a political achievement, it was a moral triumph, one that represented the culmination of a long and difficult struggle for equality. As women across the country prepared to cast their ballots for the first time in the 1920 presidential election, they did so with the knowledge that their ability to participate in democracy had been hard-earned. The 19th Amendment was not just a legal victory, it was a testament to the dedication, courage, and strength of the women who had made it possible. For those like Susan B., Anthony, whose name would forever be associated with the suffrage movement, the passage of the 19th Amendment was the final, enduring victory in their lifelong quest for equality. In the years following the passage of the 19th Amendment, Susan B., Anthony's name became synonymous with the women's suffrage movement, and her legacy began to receive the recognition it truly deserved. Although she did not live to see the final victory of women's suffrage, her relentless advocacy for equality and her strategic vision had been instrumental in achieving this historic achievement. The nation, having granted women the right to vote, now turned to honor the woman who had devoted her life to securing this right. In the immediate aftermath of the 19th Amendment's passage, the country saw a surge of recognition for the suffragists who had fought so long and hard for women's equality. While many suffragists celebrated their hard-won victory, they also honored the leaders like Susan B. Anthony, whose foundational work paved the way for the passage of the amendment. In 1920, only a few short months after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, the US government officially commemorated Susan's contributions by unveiling a statue of her in the Capitol Rotunda. This honor marked the first time a woman was given such recognition, a fitting tribute to her tireless work and her standing as the face of the suffrage movement. The unveiling of Susan B., Anthony's statue in the Capitol, was an emotionally charged moment. For many of the suffragists still living, it was a symbol of the enormous sacrifices made by women like Susan over decades of organizing, advocating, and enduring public scorn. The statue not only commemorated her work, but also became a symbol of the hard-fought victories that were won at great personal cost. Anthony's name had become intertwined with the fight for women's rights, and it was impossible to separate the two. The memorial was a powerful reminder of her dedication, courage, and the movement that she had helped lead. In the years that followed, Susan B. Anthony's influence continued to grow, especially among younger generations of women and activists. She had always been an advocate for the importance of education and activism, and many of the suffragists who followed in her footsteps were inspired by her vision of equality. During the 1920s, women who had gained the right to vote became increasingly involved in politics, and they recognized Susan B. Anthony as the trailblazer who had made their participation possible. Women across the country registered to vote in record numbers, and their influence was felt in local, state, and national elections. Though the 19th Amendment had secured the right to vote for women, it was clear that there was still much work to be done. For many suffragists, including those who had fought alongside Susan, the passage of the 19th Amendment was just the beginning. They knew that women's rights extended far beyond the ballot box, and they continued to push for further legal protections and opportunities for women. Despite the significant progress achieved, Susan B. Anthony's legacy also reminded people that true equality had not yet been fully realized. In the post-1920 years, it became apparent that women of color, particularly African American women, still face significant barriers to voting. Discriminatory practices such as poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright intimidation continued to disenfranchise many women, particularly in the southern states. The reality of these obstacles underscored the ongoing work required to ensure that the vote was not just a legal right, but also a practical reality for all women. Yet, Susan B. Anthony's legacy continued to inspire suffragists and civil rights activists alike. She had always understood that the fight for women's rights was part of a broader struggle for justice and equality. Her work in the suffrage movement had been grounded in a belief that women's equality was inseparable from racial and economic equality. In the decades that followed, suffragists, civil rights activists, and labor organizers continued to build on the foundation that Susan and her contemporaries had created. Her efforts laid the groundwork for future legal battles, such as the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, and the ongoing fight for women's rights in the 21st century. In 1923, a decade after Susan B. Anthony's death, the Equal Rights Amendment (ERA) was introduced to Congress. Though the ERA would not be passed until much later, its introduction was a direct reflection of the ideals Susan had championed throughout her life. The ERA sought to ensure that women and men were treated equally under the law, particularly in matters of employment, property ownership, and marriage. It was another example of the continuous push for women's equality, and it echoed Susan B. Anthony's lifelong belief that women's rights were central to a just society. Throughout the 1920s and beyond, Susan B. Anthony's name continued to be invoked by those advocating for gender equality, social justice, and civil rights. Her legacy was not only honoured in statues and memorials, but also in the work of those who carried forward the vision she had set into motion. Whether in the suffrage movement, labour rights, or civil rights, the influence of Susan B. Anthony remained ever present. Her legacy as a fierce advocate for women's rights and a symbol of unyielding determination continues to be celebrated today. In addition to the statue in the Capitol, numerous schools, streets, and organizations have been named in her honor, further ensuring that future generations understand the immense impact she had on American society. As the struggle for full equality continues, the memory of Susan B. Anthony serves as a reminder of the importance of perseverance, courage, and the belief that change is possible, no matter how long the road may be. As the 21st century unfolds, Susan B. Anthony's legacy endures as a foundational pillar in the ongoing struggle for women's rights. Her work in the suffrage movement, though achieved over a century ago, continues to inspire and fuel advocacy for gender equality around the world. Susan's contributions to the fight for women's voting rights remain a touchstone for those working to expand and secure the rights of women, not only in the US but across the globe. In modern times, the passing of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote in 1920, is frequently celebrated as one of the most monumental legal victories in US history. However, the broader struggle for women's equality continues, as the fight for social, economic, and political equality remains an ongoing battle. The continued influence of Susan B. Anthony's example serves as both a reminder of how far the country has come and a beacon of the work that remains to be done. Susan's efforts laid the foundation for subsequent generations of women who fought for a wide range of legal and societal changes, from equal pay to reproductive rights, from workplace protections to gender-based violence prevention. The fight for women's suffrage was not just about securing the vote, but about ensuring women could exercise their rights equally and without restrictions. While the 19th Amendment was a key victory, Susan B. Anthony's vision of equality extended far beyond this achievement. Modern-day feminists, activists, and organizations continue to invoke her name when advocating for the advancement of women's rights. Her advocacy for voting rights stands as a profound reminder that political participation is essential for the creation of a just and equitable society. Today, as women around the world continue to gain the right to vote, the importance of Susan B. Anthony's contribution is clear. Her work was not just about securing a legal right. It was about ensuring that women's voices would be heard in the halls of power, shaping laws and policies that affect their lives. Her legacy can also be seen in the continued push for equality under the law, as seen in movements like #MeToo and the ongoing fight for gender equality in politics, the workplace, and beyond. The principles Susan fought for resonate in the modern struggle against sexism, misogyny, and violence against women. Her work is remembered not only through legal victories but also through the cultural shift she helped spark, a shift that encourages women to demand equal treatment and to challenge the inequities they face. Moreover, Susan B. Anthony's work laid the groundwork for other civil rights movements that followed, including the struggle for racial justice. Her commitment to equality did not just stop with a vote for women. She recognized the interconnectedness of various social justice causes, as seen in her advocacy for African Americans during the abolitionist movement. As the U.S. continues to reckon with issues of race, gender, and class, the intersectionality Susan understood and fought for remains a critical lens through which we view modern-day activism. In education, Susan's legacy lives on through countless programs and institutions named in her honor, which promote leadership and equality for women. Schools, universities, and even community organizations use her life and work to inspire future generations of activists. Her example is taught in classrooms as a symbol of unwavering determination and the power of activism in the face of systemic oppression. Statues, memorials, and historical sites dedicated to Susan B. Anthony are scattered across the United States. Most notably, her statue in the U.S. Capitol stands as a reminder of her immense contribution to American democracy. Additionally, Susan's birthplace in Adams, Massachusetts, and her home in Rochester, New York, are preserved as historical landmarks, giving people an opportunity to reflect on the life and work of this trailblazing woman. Susan's influence extends beyond the US as well. Around the world, the principles she fought for continue to inspire women's movements, in countries where women are still denied basic rights. Her commitment to justice and equality resonates with suffragists and activists fighting for the rights of women in countries where voting and political participation remain limited. Susan B. Anthony's life is a touchstone for women's rights, symbolizing the global struggle for the full recognition of women's autonomy and voice. In the political sphere, women today occupy positions of leadership and power across the globe, and many owe this progress to the trailblazing efforts of Susan B. Anthony and other suffragists. In the US, the 19th Amendment has enabled generations of women to engage in political discourse, vote in elections, and influence government policies, bringing forward candidates, laws, and policies that reflect their interests and experiences. Women like Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg stand as powerful reminders of how far women have come and how much the political landscape has shifted since Susan's time. Though Susan B. Anthony did not live to see women achieve full political equality, her influence is felt in every election cycle, in every decision made by a woman in public office, and in the millions of votes cast by women each year. The political representation and participation that women now enjoy would not have been possible without her unwavering dedication to the cause of women's suffrage. Today, as we look at Susan B. Anthony's legacy, we see it reflected in the legal victories won by women around the world, the shifting cultural norms that challenge gender inequality, and the continued pursuit of social justice for all. Her vision of a world where women are equal participants in society remains an ongoing, evolving goal, a goal that continues to inspire and challenge activists across generations. In 1979, a significant moment of posthumous recognition came for Susan B. Anthony when the US Mint introduced a new coin featuring her likeness, the Susan B. Anthony dollar. This coin, though it was only issued for a few years, symbolized her monumental contributions to American society, and it served as a reminder of the pivotal role she played in securing women's suffrage and advocating for equal rights. The decision to feature Susan B. Anthony on a US coin was a notable acknowledgement of her contributions to the country, elevating her status to that of other historical figures who had shaped the nation's identity. The coin's introduction came more than 5 decades after Anthony's death in 1906, but it signalled a deep respect for her legacy, particularly in the wake of the women's suffrage movement's success and its influence on subsequent generations. The Susan B. Anthony dollar was a $1 coin issued by the US Mint from 1979 to 1981, with a brief return in 1999. The coin was designed by artist Glenna Goodacre and featured a portrait of Susan B. Anthony on the obverse, with the reverse depicting an eagle in flight. It was the first US coin to feature a woman who was not a mythological figure or the First Lady, making it a powerful statement in a time when women's rights and representation were increasingly coming into focus. While the coin itself did not achieve widespread circulation or long-term popularity, the introduction of the Susan B. Anthony dollar was highly symbolic. At a time when the feminist movement was gaining renewed momentum in the 1970s, it marked a public recognition of women's role in shaping the nation. The coin became an artifact that linked the historical struggle for gender equality with a modern, ongoing conversation about women's rights and their place in American society. The decision to honor Susan B. Anthony with her own coin was met with mixed reactions. Some people felt that the choice of coin as a tribute was inadequate compared to the scale of her achievements. However, others saw it as a valuable acknowledgement of her efforts, understanding the symbolic weight of having a woman who fought for equality represented on US currency. The coin became a part of the broader movement of recognizing women's historical contributions, alongside other feminist milestones such as the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment in some states, and the increased participation of women in the workforce and politics. The coin also faced some criticism for its design, as the likeness of Anthony on the coin was viewed by some as not doing justice to the strength and character that she embodied. Nonetheless, the coin remains a significant and lasting tribute to Susan B. Anthony and her legacy. It also helped to push forward the idea of gender equality in spaces where women's representation had been absent. In the context of the 1970s and 1980s, the coin came at a time when the feminist movement was experiencing a resurgence. Women had gained the right to vote decades earlier, but issues like equal pay, reproductive rights, and workplace discrimination were still significant battles. The coin symbolized the historical accomplishments of the suffragists, while also highlighting the continued struggle for equality that persisted in the late 20th century. It was a reminder that even though the vote had been secured, true equality required more, ensuring equal representation and rights in all spheres of life. The Susan B. Anthony dollar's production in the 1970s and its limited release in 1999 also served to reinforce the idea of Susan B. Anthony as a national hero. Though she was often remembered for her association with women's suffrage, her life's work transcended the right to vote. She'd been an advocate for education, for labor rights, and for racial justice, and she fought for social reform in a time when those issues were often dismissed or ignored. By featuring her on a coin, the US government acknowledged the full breadth of her influence. Despite the coin's relatively short-lived circulation, it remains a lasting part of the history of the suffrage movement. It's a physical representation of a woman who, in her lifetime, was often dismissed and even ridiculed for her radical ideas, but who ultimately achieved the highest form of respect and recognition. The coin was a testament to her relentless pursuit of justice and equality for all people. The coin's legacy endures in the modern era, where Susan B. Anthony is honoured not just through currency, but through various memorials, statues, and historical sites dedicated to her. In particular, the unveiling of the Susan B. Anthony statue in the US, Capitol Rotunda serves as a permanent tribute to her contributions. In the decades since the coin's release, her name has become increasingly synonymous with the fight for women's rights and gender equality. Moreover, the Susan B. Anthony dollar is not merely a symbol of her legacy. It also marks a significant moment in the broader narrative of women's representation in American history. It set a precedent for the ways in which women's achievements can be memorialized and acknowledged by a nation. Though the coin itself is no longer in circulation, its impact lives on as part of a larger movement to ensure that the contributions of women are recognized and celebrated. In the context of today's ongoing conversations about gender equality, women's rights, and representation, the Susan B. Anthony dollar stands as a historic reminder that the work Susan began more than a century ago continues to shape the world we live in. Her influence reaches far beyond the suffrage movement, and the coin symbolizes her place in the broader struggle for women's equality. Susan B. Anthony's legacy continues to resonate deeply in the modern feminist movement. While the suffrage victory that Susan and her contemporaries fought for was achieved with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, the ongoing struggle for gender equality in areas such as economic justice, reproductive rights, workplace equality, and social norms has kept Susan's name relevant and symbolic in contemporary society. The 1960s and 1970s saw the rise of second-wave feminism, a movement that focused on issues beyond suffrage, including reproductive rights, gender discrimination, and sexual liberation. Women were calling for equal opportunities in the workplace, for the right to control their own bodies, and for the dismantling of traditional gender roles. The success of the suffrage movement in the early 20th century provided a foundation for this new wave of feminist activism, and Susan B. Anthony's name became an enduring symbol for women's rights and gender equality. During this time, Susan B. Anthony was increasingly remembered and honored as one of the trailblazers of the feminist movement. Her relentless pursuit of the right to vote had been a precursor to the broader fight for women's rights, and her example served as an inspiration to the activists who were pushing for further societal changes. As the second-wave feminist movement gained traction, it often looked to Susan B. Anthony as an icon, a figure who had defied the social norms of her time and laid the groundwork for the eventual achievement of gender equality. Her contributions were not just celebrated by those involved in formal political movements. Susan's legacy was deeply embedded in the broader cultural consciousness. As women in the 1960s and 1970s found their voices in the fight for gender equality, they turned to the past for inspiration, and Susan B. Anthony's name became synonymous with the unwavering courage and commitment to justice that fueled the modern feminist movement. Through books, documentaries, and historical accounts, Susan B. Anthony's role as the face of the suffrage movement was reaffirmed, and the public's awareness of her contributions expanded. In schools and universities, Susan's story was taught as part of a broader curriculum that highlighted the struggles of social reformers throughout American history. Her leadership was celebrated not only for securing women's right to vote, but for her broader vision of gender equality, which was still being realized in many facets of society. As women's rights continued to expand in the latter half of the 20th century, Susan B. Anthony's name remained a powerful touchstone for those advocating for equal rights. The feminist movement in the 1960s and 1970s addressed issues like reproductive choice, sexual freedom, and workplace discrimination, topics that Susan had not directly dealt with, but whose roots could be traced back to her commitment to equality. The National Organization for Women, NOW, which was founded in 1966, drew heavily on the legacy of suffragists like Susan B. Anthony. NOW's mission to advocate for women's rights echoed the foundational work that Susan and other suffragists had begun decades earlier. While the women's liberation movement fought for new rights and freedoms, it also celebrated the victories of past feminists like Susan B. Anthony. She became more than a historical figure. she was a symbol of what was possible when women fought for their rights. As a result, she was included in the ongoing discussions about women's liberation and equality. In the 1970s, the Susan B. Anthony dollar, though short-lived in circulation, became a visible reminder of her place in the history of American feminism. The coin represented both the recognition of her past achievements and the ongoing nature of the work she began. Today, Susan B. Anthony remains a symbol of perseverance, strength, and the transformative power of activism. She is honored with statues, plaques, and memorials around the United States, including in the US, Capitol Rotunda, where her likeness is etched into the nation's political landscape. These commemorations not only reflect the reverence in which she is held, but also serve as a reminder that the fight for women's rights is far from over. Her name is invoked regularly in modern feminist discourse, particularly when discussing the ongoing struggles for women's equality. From debates over equal pay and the glass ceiling to the #MeToo movement, Susan's legacy provides a historical anchor that connects the past to the present. Her life and work continue to inspire those who seek to dismantle gender inequality in all its forms. The feminist movement today has expanded to include intersectionality, recognizing how race, class, sexuality, and other factors intersect with gender to create overlapping systems of oppression. While Susan B. Anthony's activism was rooted in her own position as a white middle-class woman, her vision of equality and justice has been expanded by modern feminists to include a broader range of voices and experiences. The struggles that she faced and the barriers she overcame serve as a powerful example for today's activists who continue to work toward a more inclusive, equitable society for all women, regardless of race or background. Susan B. Anthony's vision of a world where women could participate fully in society has found expression in the work of contemporary leaders like Kamala Harris, the first female vice president of the United States, and other trailblazing women in politics, business, and social justice. Her legacy lives on through the accomplishments of women who now, thanks to her relentless work, occupy positions of power and influence. Even as we celebrate the progress that has been made, Susan B. Anthony's life reminds us that gender equality remains a work in progress. As activists continue to fight for policies that protect reproductive rights, address sexual harassment, and promote workplace equity, Susan's story remains a source of inspiration. Her determination to challenge the system, her refusal to be silenced, and her unwavering belief in the principle of equality continue to echo in the work of those who are advancing her mission. The passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920 marked a historic achievement, yet Susan B. Anthony's work remained far from complete. Though the right to vote was secured, many of the systemic inequalities that women faced, such as unequal pay, limited access to education, and societal discrimination, persisted into the 20th century and beyond. The battle for gender equality continued long after the suffrage movement, and the foundations laid by Susan B. Anthony and other suffragists continue to shape the ongoing fight for women's rights today. While the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote, it did not immediately address the widespread gender discrimination that existed in almost every aspect of American life. Women still face significant barriers to participation in the workforce, politics, and higher education. Discriminatory practices like the exclusion of women from certain professions and lower wages for equal work were pervasive, and the notion that a woman's place was primarily in the home continued to shape societal expectations. In the years following the suffrage victory, the feminist movement continued to evolve, focusing not just on political rights, but also on issues of economic equality, reproductive rights, and social justice. The second wave of feminism, which gained momentum in the 1960s and 1970s, built on the successes of the suffrage movement while tackling the new challenges that women faced in the modern world. During the 1960s, the rise of the civil rights movement inspired women to push for their own rights and freedoms, leading to a renewed focus on equality in all areas of life. Women began to demand equal pay for equal work, access to birth control, the right to work outside the home, and protections against gender-based violence. These demands were at the heart of the feminist movement of the 20th century, which sought to ensure that the promise of gender equality, heralded by Susan B. Anthony's tireless efforts, was fully realized. The passage of the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which aimed to eliminate wage disparity based on gender, and the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited employment discrimination on the basis of sex, were major victories that reflected the principles Susan B. Anthony had championed. However, even with these legal advancements, the struggle for equal pay and workplace rights for women remained an ongoing challenge. Women continued to face barriers to career advancement and discrimination in traditionally male-dominated industries, and many earned significantly less than their male counterparts for similar work. The feminist movement continued to gain momentum through the 1970s and 1980s, culminating in significant strides toward achieving reproductive rights. The landmark Supreme Court decision in Roe v. Wade, 1973, which legalized abortion, was a major victory for women's autonomy and reproductive freedom. The decision was rooted in the broader fight for women's equality, as it affirmed women's right to make decisions about their bodies and their futures. This decision, however, remains a source of political contention, and the fight for reproductive rights continues to be one of the most divisive issues in contemporary American politics. The feminist movement also made significant strides in the 1980s and 1990s in advocating for women's rights in the workplace. The push for family leave, anti-sexual harassment laws, and women's representation in positions of leadership were key areas of focus. During this time, women began to take on more prominent roles in politics, business, and education. Figures like Hillary Clinton, Madeleine Albright, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg became powerful symbols of women's advancement in society, showing that the barriers to political and professional leadership were beginning to crack. In the 21st century, gender equality remains a focal point of global activism. The #MeToo movement, which gained widespread attention in 2017, is a powerful example of how Susan B. Anthony's legacy continues to inspire modern feminists. The #MeToo movement, which highlights the prevalence of sexual harassment and assault, has galvanized women worldwide to speak out against abuse and demand accountability. This movement has drawn on the foundational work of activists like Susan B. Anthony, whose efforts in challenging societal norms helped pave the way for women to assert their rights. One area where Susan B. Anthony's legacy is still visible is in the increasing representation of women in politics. The election of Kamala Harris as the first female Black and South Asian Vice President of the United States in 2020 was a landmark moment in American history. While Susan B. Anthony did not live to see such a moment, the achievement was a direct result of the suffrage movement she led. Kamala Harris's election is just one example of how women's political participation has changed since the passage of the 19th Amendment. The rise of women in political leadership continues to be an area where Susan B. Anthony's influence remains profoundly felt. As women continue to break down barriers and fight for their rights, Susan B. Anthony's role in this long journey of progress cannot be overstated. Her work in securing the vote for women created a ripple effect that continues to empower women to advocate for their equality in all aspects of society. The battles that Anthony fought, whether for the right to vote, for educational opportunities, or for equal treatment in the workforce, are ongoing, and the work that she began has paved the way for future generations of activists and leaders. While there is still work to be done in achieving full equality, The progress that has been made would not have been possible without the foundation that Susan B. Anthony laid. Her legacy lives on in every woman who votes, every woman who works toward social justice, and every woman who continues the fight for gender equality. The suffrage movement that Susan led was not just about securing the vote, it was about challenging the very structures that held women back, and her work remains a beacon of inspiration for anyone who fights for justice and equality. Though Susan B. Anthony's efforts were rooted in the United States, her influence on the international women's rights movement cannot be overstated. Her lifelong commitment to equality, suffrage, and social justice transcended borders, inspiring women's movements across the world and providing a model for other countries as they fought for women's right to vote and for broader gender equality. As the suffrage movement gained momentum in the US, it also inspired women's movements in countries around the world. Women in countries like the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada were closely following the progress of the American suffragists, and Susan B. Anthony's leadership became a beacon of hope for them as they fought for similar rights in their own nations. In the early 20th century, the US suffrage movement was watched with keen interest by women's rights activists globally. For example, the suffrage movement in the United Kingdom was significantly influenced by American suffragists. British suffragists such as Emmeline Pankhurst, who led the Women's Social and Political Union WSPU, drew inspiration from the work of Susan B. Anthony and other American suffragists in their fight for the right to vote. Pankhurst's efforts were marked by bold activism similar to the more militant strategies used by women like Alice Paul in the US, and both movements, though different in their tactics, were united by a common vision for women's equality. While Susan was engaged in the fight for women's suffrage in the United States, she was also aware of the global nature of the struggle for gender equality. She participated in international suffrage conferences, and her network of contacts extended across borders. She even sent letters and offered advice to suffragists in other countries, providing them with resources and strategies she'd developed over the years. She believed in the power of solidarity between women's movements across the world, and she worked to build international alliances that would strengthen the global suffrage cause. The early 20th century also saw the suffrage movement gain traction in countries like New Zealand and Australia, which were among the first nations to grant women full voting rights. New Zealand became the first self-governing country to grant women the right to vote in 1893, and Australia followed shortly after in 1902. These victories were critical milestones in the international fight for women's suffrage, and the efforts of women like Susan B. Anthony were celebrated in these countries as they too began to secure their rights. However, while the fight for suffrage was a shared goal, the suffrage movements in other countries often faced unique challenges. In some countries, women were fighting not just for the vote but also for broader social reforms, including legal rights, education, and the right to own property. For example, in many countries, suffragists were also advocating for labour rights and the protection of women and children from exploitation. The intertwined struggles were reflective of the broader global issues of equality and human rights that Susan B. Anthony and her colleagues were fighting for. In the years after the passage of the 19th Amendment, the influence of Susan B. Anthony and the American suffrage movement continued to be felt across the world. Her work in the US provided an example for other women's movements to emulate, and her name became synonymous with the broader struggle for women's rights, regardless of national boundaries. As countries in Europe, Africa, and Asia began to grapple with the issue of women's suffrage, Susan's work became a touchstone, guiding their efforts towards securing the right to vote and seeking greater equality for women. Susan B. Anthony's legacy in international women's rights is also evident in the work of international organizations that focus on gender equality, such as the United Nations. As the global community increasingly recognized the need to ensure the rights of women, The UN's Commission on the Status of Women and other global initiatives reflected the values that Susan had championed, in particular the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, 1993, and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, 1979, are in part inspired by the advocacy of early feminists like Susan, who fought for women to be recognized as full citizens with equal rights in all aspects of life. Throughout the 20th century, Susan B. Anthony's influence on international women's rights continued to be evident as women around the world secured the right to vote, the right to work, and the right to education. Countries like France, Italy, and Germany granted women the right to vote in the mid-20th century, while other countries, such as Saudi Arabia, only granted women suffrage in the 21st century. Susan's vision of a world where women could participate fully in public life became a global reality, and her tireless work continues to inspire suffragists, activists, and leaders who are committed to advancing gender equality worldwide. Susan's commitment to international women's rights was also reflected in her support for women in the developing world. She recognized that women's rights were not confined to the issues of voting, but also included access to education, healthcare, and the ability to live free from violence and discrimination. Her advocacy for women's full participation in all aspects of society laid the groundwork for international policies that prioritize gender equality, including the UN's Sustainable Development Goal 5, which aims to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls by 2030. Today, as the world continues to grapple with issues of gender inequality, Susan B. Anthony's global impact remains undeniable. Her work in securing women's right to vote provided a foundation for the broader struggle for women's rights, one that transcended national borders and resonated with women's movements worldwide. Susan B. Anthony's tireless advocacy continues to inspire new generations of activists around the world, reminding them that the fight for gender equality is a universal cause, one that requires continued perseverance, solidarity, and action. In 2020, the United States marked the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, a momentous occasion that celebrated the long-awaited achievement of voting rights for women. The centennial of this milestone was not only a time for reflection, but also a time for honoring the leaders of the suffrage movement, with Susan B. Anthony standing out as one of the central figures in the history of women's rights in America. The centennial celebration allowed the nation to look back on the struggles, triumphs, and continuing work that came out of the suffrage movement, much of which was made possible by Susan's relentless efforts. The 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, granted women the legal right to vote. It was the culmination of over 70 years of activism, protests, and tireless advocacy. However, Susan B. Anthony did not live to see this victory. She passed away in 1906. Nevertheless, the 100th anniversary provided an opportunity to reflect on how much had been achieved in the century since the amendment's passage, and to recognize the enduring influence of the suffrage movement's leaders, particularly Susan B. Anthony. The centennial anniversary of the 19th Amendment sparked a renewed conversation about women's rights and gender equality, highlighting the ongoing struggles that women face in the political, social, and economic spheres. As much as the anniversary was a celebration of women's suffrage, it also brought attention to the fact that women of colour, especially black women, had to face additional barriers to voting even after the 19th Amendment's passage. In many states, discriminatory practices such as poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright voter suppression efforts were used to disenfranchise women of colour. These challenges continued to affect women's political participation for decades after the amendment's ratification. Throughout the 100th anniversary celebrations, Susan B. Anthony's name was invoked as a symbol of the broader struggle for women's rights. Her fight for voting rights was not just about securing the ballot box. It was about ensuring women's full participation in society, equal to men. This principle of equality, which Anthony championed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, remains at the heart of feminist movements today. In 2020, the centennial year, Susan B. Anthony was honored in various ways. There were public ceremonies, exhibits, and programs dedicated to her legacy. Museums, historical sites, and schools organized events to teach new generations about her role in the suffrage movement. Her contributions were recognized not only by suffrage organizations but also by political leaders who paid tribute to the foundation she helped lay for gender equality. Even political figures like then Vice President Kamala Harris, the first woman to hold the office, spoke about how the suffrage movement paved the way for women's participation in government and politics, giving a poignant nod to Susan's pioneering work. One of the most significant tributes to Susan B. Anthony came in the form of a campaign to honor her with a commemorative coin. As part of the centennial celebrations, the U.S. Mint produced a series of coins in her honor, paying tribute to the suffrage movement and Susan's pivotal role in it. These coins, like the earlier Susan B. Anthony dollar, served as lasting symbols of her commitment to women's rights and the ongoing fight for gender equality. The coins were released in limited quantities, and their sale contributed to funds supporting women's education and advocacy for continued progress in women's rights. The centennial also focused on the challenges that remain in the fight for gender equality. While the 19th Amendment secured women's right to vote, the political landscape continues to present obstacles to full equality. Issues such as gender-based violence, wage disparities, reproductive rights, and underrepresentation of women in politics and leadership roles are still at the forefront of the feminist movement. The commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment helped reinvigorate efforts to continue the work that Susan B. Anthony began, with modern feminists advocating for the full realization of women's rights. The anniversary also marked the ongoing progress in women's political participation. In the century since the amendment's passage, women have increasingly taken positions of leadership in politics, business, academia, and the arts. Kamala Harris's election as vice president in 2020, for instance, was a groundbreaking moment in American history, and her victory was seen by many as a testament to the struggles of women like Susan B. Anthony. While there is still much work to be done in achieving gender equality, Susan B. Anthony's fight for women's right to vote provided the foundation for the women who came after her to take their place in the political arena. In addition to political representation, women's rights activists in the 21st century continue to fight for reproductive rights, gender-based violence prevention, equal pay, and other forms of equality that Susan B. Anthony would have undoubtedly supported. The centennial celebration of the 19th Amendment underscored the ongoing need for gender equality and social justice, and it provided an opportunity to renew efforts to build a more inclusive society for women of all backgrounds. Susan B. Anthony's enduring legacy is a testament to the power of one person's dedication to changing the course of history. The 100th anniversary of women's suffrage was not just a celebration of the past, it was a reminder that the struggle for gender equality is ongoing. The work that began with Susan B. Anthony continues through the efforts of activists, organizations, and women who, inspired by her example, are pushing for change every day. As we move further into the 21st century, the legacy of Susan B. Anthony remains a powerful force in the ongoing struggle for gender equality. Her work laid the foundation for countless feminist movements and continues to shape the global conversation on women's rights today. While the suffrage victory in 1920 was a monumental achievement, Susan's advocacy for broader social change and gender equality transcended the right to vote, and her influence is felt in contemporary issues ranging from reproductive rights to Workplace equality. In recent years, the feminist movement has evolved to include intersectionality, the understanding that women's experiences of inequality are shaped by intersecting factors like race, class, sexual orientation, and ability. This evolution builds on Susan B. Anthony's vision, as she recognized that women's rights were interconnected with the larger struggle for racial equality, social justice, and human rights. While her focus was primarily on women's suffrage, she was also an advocate for the abolition of slavery, education, and labor reform, all of which have continued to influence contemporary feminist discourse. The modern feminist movement has embraced many of the ideals Susan B. Anthony championed, including the idea that all individuals, regardless of gender, should be equal participants in public and private life. For example, the #MeToo movement, which gained widespread traction in 2017, echoes Susan's work by exposing the prevalence of sexual harassment and violence against women. The movement has led to sweeping changes in how sexual assault and harassment are addressed in the workplace, the media, and beyond, as well as a shift in cultural attitudes toward women's autonomy and power. Susan's legacy is also alive in the ongoing battle for reproductive rights. The right to control one's own body, central to women's equality, is an issue that Susan B. Anthony would have supported given her fierce commitment to ensuring that women had full agency over their lives. While Susan's era lacked the legal framework for reproductive rights that modern activists fight for today, her advocacy for women's autonomy laid the groundwork for the fights to come. Organizations such as Planned Parenthood and other reproductive justice movements continue to build upon the foundation she helped create, advocating for accessible health care, family planning, and the right to make decisions regarding one's own body. Another significant area in which Susan B. Anthony's influence is still evident is the ongoing fight for equal pay. Susan believed that women's economic independence was as vital as their political rights, and she tirelessly worked to ensure that women were recognized as equal contributors to the workforce. Today, women continue to face a gender wage gap, and while progress has been made, true economic equality remains elusive. Modern-day feminists often invoke Susan's commitment to economic justice as they push for equal pay for equal work, paid family leave, and other labor reforms that address the unique challenges women face in the workplace. Susan's influence can also be seen in the growing representation of women in leadership roles. From politics to business to the arts, women are increasingly holding positions of power, something that would have seemed unthinkable in Susan's time. The election of Kamala Harris as the first woman and the first woman of color to serve as Vice President of the United States in 2020 was a historic moment that drew on the decades of work laid by suffragists like Susan B. Anthony. Though she did not live to see such a moment, her advocacy for women's full participation in the political process paved the way for future generations of women leaders. The feminist movement today is also deeply connected to global efforts for gender equality, as countries around the world continue to grapple with issues such as domestic violence, child marriage, and access to education for girls. The global feminist movement looks to the work of past leaders like Susan B. Anthony for guidance. Organizations like UN Women and international initiatives focused on gender equality draw on the vision of suffragists who believed that women should have an equal voice in all spheres of society. Despite the progress made in the century since the 19th Amendment, women's rights are still under threat. The backlash against reproductive rights, the underrepresentation of women in positions of power, and the persistence of gender-based violence remind us that the struggle for gender equality is far from over. Susan B. Anthony's legacy serves as both a source of inspiration and a call to action, urging today's activists to keep fighting for justice and equality in all its forms. In recent years, the younger generation of feminists has revitalized the movement, using technology and social media to amplify their voices and challenge traditional structures of power. Platforms like Twitter and Instagram have become powerful tools for organizing protests, advocating for policy change, and highlighting the experiences of marginalized women. These modern movements, such as women's marches and the global #MeToo movement, continue to invoke Susan B. Anthony's legacy by demanding that women's voices are heard and that their rights are respected. As we reflect on Susan B. Anthony's life and work, we're reminded that the fight for gender equality is ongoing. While the suffrage movement secured a critical victory for women in the United States, the battle for true equality continues in every aspect of life, whether that's in the workplace, in education, in politics, or in the cultural norms that continue to shape women's lives. Susan B. Anthony's work laid the foundation for the progress we've made, and her spirit of activism, determination, and courage continues to inspire those who are working to build a more just and equitable world for all. Her legacy is not confined to the pages of history books or the statues erected in her honor. It lives on in the actions of today's feminists, in the political representation of women, and in the ongoing fights for economic justice, reproductive rights, and the eradication of gender-based violence. Susan B. Anthony's work set in motion the changes that continue to transform society, and her influence will continue to shape the feminist movement for generations to come. As we approach the final stages of examining Susan B. Anthony's life and legacy, it becomes clear that her place in history is not simply as a figure of the past, but as a symbol of the ongoing struggle for gender equality. The suffrage movement she helped lead was one of the most pivotal campaigns in American history, and her contributions continue to influence the fight for women's rights today. Susan's impact is often felt through her foundational work in securing the vote for women, but her legacy goes far beyond that achievement. She was a multifaceted activist addressing issues of social justice that extended into race, education, and labor rights. As we reflect on her place in history, we must also consider how modern recognition of her contributions both honors her work and challenges us to continue the fight for full equality. At the time of Susan B. Anthony's death in 1906, women had not yet fully achieved political equality in the US, and gender discrimination was still entrenched in many aspects of society. However, the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920 was a direct result of the work of Susan and other suffragists. While Susan did not live to see the final victory, her spirit and efforts were pivotal in turning the tide toward women's rights in America. For decades after the amendment's passage, women continued to push for other forms of equality, including equal pay, access to education, and protection against discrimination. And as the feminist movement continued to evolve, it was Susan B. Anthony's tireless dedication to justice that continued to guide and inspire. Today, Susan B. Anthony is universally recognized as one of the most important figures in the history of American civil rights. Statues in her honor can be found across the country, including in the US Capitol, where she became the first woman to be depicted in the rotunda. Her likeness is also featured in many educational spaces and museums, where visitors can learn about her groundbreaking work for women's rights. The Susan B. Anthony House in Rochester, New York serves as a living tribute to her life, preserving the history of her advocacy and offering a place for reflection on the broader movement she helped ignite. As much as Susan B. Anthony's contributions are celebrated, her legacy is also a reminder that progress is never linear. The 19th Amendment was a monumental achievement, but women's equality, particularly for women of color, did not follow easily or automatically. Discriminatory practices like voter literacy tests, poll taxes, and other forms of disenfranchisement continued to prevent many women from fully realizing their rights. Even as women voted for the first time in the 1920 elections, the political landscape was still one in which women of color, especially African American women in the South, faced incredible obstacles. These ongoing challenges highlight the importance of remembering Susan B. Anthony not just as a historical figure who secured a legal victory, but as a symbol of the continued struggle for justice and equality. Her work laid the groundwork for future feminist movements, including the civil rights movement and the ongoing fight for reproductive rights, equal pay, and gender-based violence prevention. Susan B. Anthony's legacy teaches us that the fight for women's rights is ongoing and must be continually pushed forward to address new challenges. The 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment in 2020 marked an important moment in recognizing Susan B. Anthony's legacy, but it also served as a call to action. For women's rights activists, the centennial was not only a celebration of the right to vote, but also a reminder that true equality has yet to be fully realized. Issues like the gender wage gap, reproductive rights, and the underrepresentation of women in positions of power remain at the forefront of feminist activism. As the suffrage movement evolved into a broader struggle for women's rights, Susan B. Anthony's enduring influence was felt in these ongoing campaigns for justice. The centennial also brought to the forefront the need to honor and remember the contributions of women of color to the suffrage movement. While Susan B. Anthony's work was instrumental in securing the right to vote, it's crucial to acknowledge the role played by black women and other women of color, whose struggles were compounded by both gender and racial discrimination. Figures like Ida B. Wells, Sojourner Truth, and Mary Church Terrell fought alongside Susan and others to ensure that the suffrage movement addressed the needs of all women. Recognizing their contributions is an essential part of understanding the full history of women's rights in America. In recognizing Susan B. Anthony's place in history, we must also examine how her legacy lives on in the women who continue the fight for equality. From the election of Kamala Harris as the first female vice president of the United States, to the #MeToo movement's challenge to gendered power structures, to the increased participation of women in political office and social movements, Susan B. Anthony's influence continues to be seen in the rise of women's leadership in all fields. Her advocacy for women's full participation in society paved the way for the women who now serve as powerful examples for future generations. Susan B. Anthony's vision of equality and her unyielding fight for women's rights remain a cornerstone of feminist thought and activism. Her efforts have had lasting impacts that stretch far beyond the voting booth, shaping the continued struggle for women's full autonomy and agency. Though Susan's fight for equality was focused on securing the right to vote, her work addressed much more than political participation. It encompassed the fight for women to be treated with dignity and respect, to have access to equal opportunities, and to live free from the constraints of gender-based discrimination. As we reflect on Susan B. Anthony's place in history, we're reminded that her legacy is not just a historical footnote, but a living, evolving force. Her commitment to gender equality has shaped every subsequent generation of women's rights activists and continues to inspire those who fight for justice today. The ongoing struggle for women's rights is a testament to Susan B. Anthony's vision and the work she began over a century ago, reminding us that her legacy is not one of past accomplishments, but one that compels us to continue the work of creating a more just and equitable world for all. As we conclude this journey through the life and legacy of Susan B. Anthony, we're reminded of the profound impact she had not only on her time, but on the generations that followed. Her contributions to the women's suffrage movement were groundbreaking, and her tireless advocacy for women's rights created ripples that have lasted far beyond her death. Susan B. Anthony may have passed away in 1906, but her work continues to shape the struggle for gender equality and remains a key part of feminist thought and activism. Susan B. Anthony's fight for women's suffrage was not just about securing a legal right. It was about ensuring that women could fully participate in society, contributing their voices to the decisions that shaped their lives. Her unyielding determination and refusal to accept the status quo paved the way for women to achieve political power in a nation that had long excluded them. Yet, while the 19th Amendment, passed in 1920, was a victory for women's right to vote, Susan's vision was much broader. She wanted to see women fully integrated into every aspect of life, whether political, social, or economic. Her legacy lives on in the continued efforts to break down barriers that prevent women from achieving full equality. The feminist movements of the 20th and 21st centuries, including the fight for equal pay, reproductive rights, and women's representation in leadership, can trace their roots back to Susan B. Anthony's work. Her advocacy for equality transcended the right to vote, laying the groundwork for a world in which women have the freedom to live and thrive on their own terms. The 19th Amendment was a monumental achievement, but as Susan B. Anthony understood, it was only one part of the journey toward full gender equality. Women's rights activists today, from grassroots organizations to global movements, continue to push for the broader social and economic justice that Susan fought for. The work she began has been carried forward by millions of women and men who fight for the realization of a truly equal society, where gender is no longer a barrier to opportunity, security, or freedom. The commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment in 2020 brought renewed attention to the struggles women face today. While much has been accomplished, there is still much work to do. The fight for reproductive rights, the ongoing struggle against gender-based violence, the call for equal pay, and the demand for more women in leadership roles are just a few of the areas where Susan B. Anthony's influence continues to be felt. Her legacy serves as a touchstone for those who continue to advocate for women's rights and remind us that the work she began is far from complete. As we reflect on Susan B. Anthony's extraordinary life, we see that she was not just a suffragist but a visionary. She understood that equality was not just about political participation. It was about creating a society where women could fully access their rights and opportunities without facing discrimination. Her activism was a direct challenge to the gender norms of her time, and her fight continues to inspire today's activists who refuse to accept that women's equality has been fully realized. Throughout her life, Susan B. Anthony faced enormous challenges: opposition from entrenched political forces, personal sacrifices, and social stigma. Yet she persisted, and in her persistence she forged a path for the generations that followed, a path that continues to inspire today. Her courage, vision, and tireless commitment to justice were instrumental in transforming the legal and social status of women. But more than that, they were a testament to the power of activism and the ability of one person to change the course of history. Her name will forever be associated with the suffrage movement and the fight for gender equality. But her legacy also reminds us that social change is a long, hard journey. Susan B. Anthony did not see the full realization of her dream in her lifetime, but she understood that the fight for justice requires a steady, unwavering commitment, a commitment to breaking down the systems of inequality that restrict the freedom of half the population. In conclusion, Susan B. Anthony's legacy is not just in the women who voted for the first time in 1920 or in the 19th Amendment she helped pass. It is in the lives of the millions of women and men who continue to fight for justice, for equal opportunity, and for a world where gender is no longer a limiting factor. Her impact extends far beyond her time, and her work remains a touchstone for the ongoing struggle to achieve true equality. Susan B. Anthony's story is one of triumph over adversity, of a single individual's vision changing the course of history, but it is also a reminder of the ongoing work we must all do to ensure that the rights she fought for are fully realised for every woman, everywhere. The fight for equality is not over. It is a continuing journey, one that Susan B. Anthony began, and one that we must all continue to carry forward in her honour. As we conclude this journey through the life and legacy of Susan B. Anthony, we are reminded that her work is far from over. The 19th Amendment was a monumental achievement, but the fight for gender equality continues to evolve. Susan's dedication to women's rights and her unyielding commitment to justice paved the way for the feminist movements of today. Her legacy serves as both a foundation and a call to action for all who believe in equality. Susan B. Anthony's vision was not limited to securing the right to vote. It was about creating a world where women are equal in every aspect of society. Today, her name remains synonymous with the fight for justice, and her work is reflected in the countless strides women have made since. From the suffrage movement to the modern-day struggles for equal pay, reproductive rights, and an end to gender-based violence, the echoes of Susan's advocacy reverberate through every victory and every battle. Though Susan may have passed away before witnessing the final fulfillment of her mission, her legacy is alive in the work of activists, leaders, and everyday women who carry the torch she lit. She proved that one person, driven by passion and unwavering conviction, can change the course of history. And as long as the fight for gender equality continues, so too will the influence of Susan B. Anthony. Her story reminds us that equality is a journey, one that requires perseverance, courage, and above all the belief that a better, more just world is possible. It's a journey that we together must continue. Thank you for reflecting on the remarkable life of Susan B. Anthony. Let her legacy inspire you to continue the work for justice, equality, and the empowerment of women everywhere.